somewhere along a quiet stretch of the ancient Silk Road, far from the cities that rise in clay and stone, and farther still from the coasts where ships rock in shallow harbors, a merchant camp rests beneath a canopy of stars, nestled in a gentle depression between two low dunes, where the wind moves like a whisper, carrying only the scent of dust and distance. And here, in the blue-gray dark before sunrise, the world seems paused, as if time itself is taking a slow breath, and the tents, shaped like half-moons and staked into the hard-packed earth, sit still, their fabric slightly rustling only when the faintest current of air brushes past, and around them, scattered in deliberate patterns, born of repetition and necessity, lie the tools and tokens of the long journey, bundles of fabric wrapped in waxed cloth to keep the dew out, folded mats made stiff from salt, saddles set in pairs with the reins looped like sleeping snakes, and water jars resting against the backs of snoring camels, whose breaths rise in the soft plumes, visible even in the faint light. And within one of the tents, low and narrow, with seams stitched tight against the wind, a man lies curled in a heavy wool cloak, the edges drawn tightly beneath his chin, his face shadowed except for the faint outline of his nose and the rhythmic rise of his chest, and beside him, another figure, younger, perhaps his son or apprentice, murmurs in his sleep, lips parting to shape a dream that slips away before it can finish. And beyond them, the fire pit has gone cold, but not empty, with pale gray coals holding the ghost of last night's heat, and a single iron pot sits tilted on its side, its rim catching the first traces of light from a sky that is just now beginning to move from ink to indigo. And in this stillness, in this space that is neither night nor morning, a sense of complete and quiet presence settles over the camp, like another blanket, one woven not from thread, but from dust and memory. And even the camels, creatures of burden and temper, stand silently, tethered and blinking slowly, their long eyelashes motionless, their legs folded beneath them like the wooden supports of market stalls. And far away, just past the gentle hill that shields this sight from the open plain, a river can be heard if one listens closely, not in a rush but in a mutter, its voice caught between pebbles and shaped by the slope. And even though it is out of sight, its presence brings a kind of comfort, as if the entire caravan, asleep and breathing softly, is being watched over by the land itself, and there are no sharp sounds, no urgency, no movement, save for the slow shifting of a tent corner or the tiny clicking of hooves from a tethered goat adjusting its position in the sand. And for now, before the sun breaks the sky, before trade resumes and steps are taken and prices are named, there is only this: the camp in its deepest rest, the pause between yesterday and today, the quiet hours that the Silk Road always gave to those who traveled it, a silence born not from emptiness but from purpose held in waiting, cradled in the arms of a patient earth, lying just beneath the sloped canvas of the central tent, where the sand has been slightly hollowed out to make the sleeping surface flatter and the air a little cooler. There rests a leather satchel, darkened by years of sun and sweat, and speckled with the pale dust of countless deserts, crossed and plains endured. its seams stitched with thick thread that has frayed in places but never broken, the kind of bag that belongs not to the journey itself, but to the person who walks it. And this satchel, placed deliberately near the sleeping merchant's side, is not large or ornate or particularly well made, but it has lasted through more roads than any single season could count, and its contents, though few, are as familiar to its owner as the lines on his hand. Inside, carefully arranged in a manner that allows for both protection and speed of access, are items that carry the weight of small, quiet importance. A tightly rolled scroll, sealed with hardened beeswax that bears no inscription on its outside, but contains a list of prices for spices and cloths in distant towns the merchant may or may not ever reach. A polished bone comb wrapped in a square of linen to keep the teeth from snapping, used each morning in the brief moments before tents are collapsed and camels loaded. A short length of twine tied at both ends with simple knots, useful for repairs, but never once used for anything grander than securing a mat or fastening a broken sandal strap. A pouch of dried fruit, mostly dates and apricots, flattened and soft from the press of the bag's other contents, its string drawn tight to keep the scent from luring mice or insects. And folded beneath these is a square of cloth that once served as a head covering, now too worn for sun or wind, but kept still for reasons the merchant does not examine too closely, perhaps because it reminds him of a place, or a person, or a time when the road was shorter, and the weight of the journey lighter, and tucked into the side pocket is a smooth, flat stone, smaller than a coin, and completely unremarkable in color or shape, but heavy in its familiarity, often rolled between the fingers during pauses or held in the palm while sitting near the fire, its surface now polished not by water or sand, but by the slow erosion of thoughtful handling. And though these objects are not valuable in the way merchants speak of silver or silk or cinnamon bark, they are indispensable in the way that only companions can be, each one a piece of the road's rhythm, each one held not for beauty or utility alone, but for how it fits into the quiet pauses of travel. And in the stillness before dawn, the satchel rests beside its owner like a dog at the heel, loyal without needing acknowledgement, shaped by the road as much as the road is shaped by it. And when the man eventually stirs and rises to begin the day, he will reach for it first, not because he needs it urgently, but because he always does, because the day begins not with loud steps or shouted orders, but with the soft lift of leather and the creak of a strap sliding over one shoulder. And so for now, it waits, still, holding its small, silent truths in the half-dark, resting in a world that moves only when it is ready to be moved, in the delicate hour before the sun fully awakens, when the horizon is painted with a soft wash of indigo and blush, and the vast desert seems to hold its breath. The quiet sound of camel hooves carries through the air like a whispered memory, each measured step resonating softly over the hardened, cool sand, forming a gentle cadence that intertwines with the distant rustle of wind-stirred dunes and the faint murmur of a sleeping caravan. These hooves, heavy yet unhurried, tread the ancient road with a patient rhythm that has echoed for centuries, their sound subdued enough to be felt rather than heard, as though the earth itself listens in reverence to every careful, deliberate press of foot and the soft clatter of leather straps adjusting on saddles. And amid this unfolding serenade, a slender figure, wrapped in a faded cotton robe and a leather hat softened by travel, slowly emerges from a cluster of tents set at the outskirts of the camp, his silhouette outlined by the dim glow of the approaching day as he adjusts the pack on his back, the fabric creasing gently with each measured step. He moves with the quiet dignity of one who has long learned that the journey is as much a meditation as it is a necessity, his footsteps merging with those of his caravan in a tapestry of sound that is both ancient and immediate. Around him, the soft murmurs of fellow travelers begin to stir from their slumber, each voice low and indistinct, carrying tales of far-off markets and promised deals that have yet to be made. And even the camels, those storied beasts of burden, whose tired eyes reflect innumerable nights under starlight, seem to ease into the day with a slow, rhythmic breathing that syncs with the heartbeat of the desert itself as the faint light grows incrementally, brushing the tips of the dunes with a tender gold. The caravan's procession becomes a moving silhouette, its lines and gaps marked by the steady sound of hooves and the occasional subtle clink of metal as a water jug is shifted or a scroll unfurls, a sound that speaks of endurance, the unspoken promise that even the most arduous journey is composed of countless, small, deliberate moments that together carry its travelers across untamed sands and through quiet, endless hours. And within this space, where every step on the ancient Silk Road seems imbued with the quiet magic of time itself, the air holds the scent of sun-warmed sand, of incense burned in far-off bazaars, and of dried herbs pressed into bundles carried along as silent companions by those who wander, each note a delicate reminder that the road is not merely a path from one place to another, but a continuous, meditative unfolding of life, where every echo of camel hooves, every rustle of fabric, and every gentle murmur of the waking caravan becomes part of a greater lullaby, promising that the day, when it finally arrives, in full light, will be as measured and tender as the hours just before dawn, as the pale light of early morning gently spills across the edge of the encampment, seeping over the cracked earth and creeping into the folds of sleeping mats and blankets. The most patient task of the morning begins without ceremony, the boiling of a small pot of tea over a low, carefully tended flame, coaxed into life with the gentlest breath, and the crumbling of twigs gathered the evening before, each one chosen not for its perfection, but for its dryness, its willingness to catch and burn with a steady whisper, and the pot itself, dented and blackened from years of use, sits squarely atop 3 rounded stones, arranged in a triangle, each stone bearing the faint scorch marks of countless fires past, a quiet trio that has supported not only the pot, but the rhythm of each morning, day after day, through deserts, along rivers, and under stars. And within the pot, the water, drawn from a goatskin bag hours earlier, cold and tasting faintly of leather and travel, begins to tremble along its surface, not with the fierce bubble of a rushed boil, but with a soft shiver, the kind that hints at heat without claiming it, as if the tea itself must wake slowly, just like the travelers. And nearby, crouched with his knees tucked to his chest, the older merchant watches with practiced eyes, not stirring the pot, not rushing the fire, but simply waiting, because waiting is what the road has taught him best. That everything worthwhile, warmth, flavor, clarity, comes not from haste, but from steadiness, and in his hand a small cloth pouch rests, worn soft with years, its drawstring loose from being tied and untied countless times, and within it the dried herbs that pass for tea on the road, a few crushed leaves from a shrub gathered near a desert well, a pinch of bark with a mild bitterness, a scattering of seeds that pop faintly when dropped into the heat, and though it is not luxurious, not spiced or fragrant in the way that tea might be in cities, with tall walls and gardens, it is known. And in that familiarity, there is comfort. And when the merchant finally adds the contents of the pouch into the water, it's done with a movement so quiet, so minimal, it almost seems like the herbs simply fall on their own, drawn toward the warmth that rises now in visible swirls, and the scent that follows is subtle, earthy, the kind that doesn't fill the air, but lingers just above the pot, like a memory you don't need to chase because you know it will remain. And as the tea steeps, he doesn't measure time in minutes or temperature, but in the soft change of light on the sand, in the way the breeze shifts slightly to carry the first sounds of morning. A camel snorting softly, a child stirring under a blanket, the slow murmur of cloth being folded, and when at last he pours the tea into small, handleless cups made of fired clay, the color of cooled ash, the liquid moves like oil, dark and steady, with no steam, no drama, only heat that will warm the hands and the belly and the moment, and the others, one by one, gather without speaking, drawn not by the tea alone, but by the ritual of its making, by the shared stillness it promises, and they sit cross-legged in the dirt, forming a loose circle, without needing to agree on its shape, and they sip slowly, heads bowed slightly, not out of reverence, but out of ease, because here, on this road, in this hour, there is no rush to begin the day, only the shared truth that even the longest journey starts best with a pot of tea that refuses to hurry, within one of the flatter tents near the heart of the caravan, where the cloth walls hang low and the air feels slightly cooler because the morning sun hasn't yet crested the eastern ridge. There lies a modest leather-bound ledger, its cover dull from the dust and oil of 100 fingers, and its corners softened from years of being tucked into satchels, pressed beneath sleeping mats, or wrapped in layers of cloth when the road turned wet. And this ledger, thicker than it appears, is not filled with elegant calligraphy or symbols drawn in ink as dark as night, but instead with slow, thoughtful scratches of charcoal and smudged pigment, marks that to the untrained eye would appear chaotic or accidental, mere scribbles in long faded lines, but to the man who keeps it, a quiet figure named Farid, who is known less for his voice than for his certainty. Every mark is memory, every dot a figure, and every faint line a story, told not aloud, but through numbers and exchanges, trade goods and weights, names of distant towns, and the approximate value of wool in one region versus the demand for glass beads in another. And Farid, who never rushes to speak and often appears asleep, even while seated upright, spends each dawn with this ledger open on his lap, a sharpened stick of charcoal in one hand, a cloth-wrapped stone resting beside him to hold the pages down when the desert breeze grows curious. And as the others begin to move about the camp, checking saddles and adjusting straps, Farid remains still, bent over the page, like a monk in some ancient archive, his eyes scanning not just the current column, but the rhythm of past ones, looking for patterns only he can see. And though he does not count aloud or tap his fingers in thought, the decisions he makes in these moments will ripple throughout the day. How many bundles to trade? What path to take if a route has grown too costly? Whether to press on or stay and wait for word from the west. And the ledger, dense with cross-referenced markings, sometimes includes a word or two in his native tongue, pressed into the margin like a whispered reminder from an older self. Words like sweet figs, or too late, or once simply rain, drawn in tighter handwriting as though to prevent even the parchment from overhearing, and no one else asks to see. The ledger, not because it's forbidden, but because they know it would speak only in riddles, without Farid's voice. And even he, if asked directly what something meant, would only respond with a shrug and the faintest smile, as though the numbers weren't instructions but companions. And when the light grows stronger, and the first camel grunts impatiently for motion, Farid gently closes the book, wraps it in a piece of woven cloth, whose pattern has nearly vanished from wear, and tucks it under his arm like one might carry a loaf of bread, or a sleeping cat, not with reverence, but with understanding, because the ledger does not command the road, but it follows it, traces it, remembers it, page by page, day by day, becoming over time not just a record of trade, but a record of being. And even when the day is long, and the goods are few, and the wind unfriendly, the ledger remains a quiet companion, asking nothing, offering only the comfort of knowing that someone, somewhere, is keeping track, not of success or failure, but simply of where they've been and what they carried to get there, long after the tents have been rolled and folded into careful bundles, after the camels have been loaded with saddlebags full of dried fruit, wool and bronze trinkets wrapped in cloth, after the last cup of tea has cooled and the coals have been scattered so they leave no trace of where the fire once lived. The sand remains, soft, unassuming, always moving even when still, like a quiet observer that slips into every fold of fabric, every crevice between toes, every corner of every crate, no matter how tightly it has been shut. And though the merchants and porters and herders brush it away each morning with hands and cloths and the backs of sleeves, they all know that the sand is never truly gone, because the Silk Road is not just a trail that winds across the continent, but a river of earth that flows beneath them, into them, around them. And as the caravan sets out under the muted glow of a sun that has not yet found its heat. The sand crunches beneath boots and hooves, forming temporary patterns that disappear with the next gust of wind. Every footprint, a momentary sentence in the long story of travel, written and erased before it can be read. And even now, in the folds of the lead merchant's robe, grains of sand from the last resting place shift against his skin, reminding him, not unpleasantly, that comfort on the road is not absence of dust or ache, but familiarity with it. And in the saddlebags, nestled between layers of dried reeds, meant to cushion the precious cargo, the sand has already crept in, fine and pale and inevitable, dusting the bottoms of jars and settling inside the folds of embroidered cloth destined for market stalls, in places whose names are spoken like dreams. And the youngest traveler in the group, a boy not yet old enough to lead a camel alone, opens his hand and watches the sand sift through his fingers during a pause in the journey, amused by the way it seems both nothing and everything, light as breath, but capable of carving stone when given enough time. And his father, standing nearby, does not tell him to hurry or move on, but lets the boy feel the texture of the sand, because part of becoming a traveler is learning that the sand is never the enemy. It is the road itself. And when they stop to rest beneath a low, sloping cliff where the sun casts striped shadows against the face of the rock, the travelers again shake out their cloaks, tap their boots, sweep their mats, but the sand remains, coating everything with a fine memory of movement, of place, of yesterday, and even in the water jugs, sealed tightly and wrapped in cloth, a few stray grains float near the rim where the skin meets the clay, like reminders that purity is not the same as sterility, and that even refreshment carries the dust of the road. And at night, when the stars return and the tents are raised, once more, when the wind has stilled and the fire returns to its circle of stones, the sand will be there too, in the corners of the blankets, between the pages of Farid's ledger, beneath the fingernails of the man who stirred the pot of tea. And though no one speaks of it, they all feel it, not as an annoyance, but as the thread that ties them together, the ever-present texture of the journey, the quiet proof that they are indeed on the Silk Road, and that the road, like the sand, is not just something they pass through. It is something that settles into them and stays, dangling from a thick leather strap looped around the muscular neck of the caravan's lead camel. Camel, just below the point where the coarse fur grows denser and darker from sweat and sun, hangs a small bronze bell, its surface dulled and pitted from years of wear, its sound softened by time into a low, almost melodic clink that drifts behind the beast like a whispered lullaby, rising and falling with each deliberate sway of the camel's step. And though it is barely audible in the broader silence of the morning's march, its steady rhythm becomes a kind of anchor, a marker of presence and movement, letting those behind know that the path continues forward, that no one is lost, that the lead still leads. And the bell, though never polished or tuned, has become as familiar as the call of a name, as trusted as the sun's daily return. And in its sound is not urgency, not command, but the gentle reassurance of continuity. And every morning, before the first bundle is lifted, before the mats are rolled, and the embers coaxed back to life, the same man checks the strap, runs his thumb along the bell's narrow rim, taps it once, not to test it, but to greet it, and adjusts it just slightly so that it hangs free without catching on the beast's thick hair. And throughout the day, as the caravan weaves slowly across the land, navigating dried riverbeds and wind-shaped ridges and occasional stretches of flat earth where the sun seems to press downward like a weight, the bell remains steady, never hurrying, never silenced, always there, casting its sound backward into the column of travelers, like a thread that binds them to the road and to each other. And the children in the group, those too small to carry goods or lead animals, often listen for it more carefully than the adults, playing small games in their minds as they match the bell's pattern to the movement of their own steps, or pretending that it speaks in code, like a story being told only to those who really listen. And when they stop at midday, when the shade is thin and welcome, and the camels are unburdened, just long enough to rest, but not long enough to forget, the bell is the last thing to be heard before the stillness settles, and the first sound to resume when the journey continues. And at night, after the animals have knelt, and the loads are off, and the stars above begin their slow drift across the open sky, the bell is gently wrapped in cloth, not to protect it from damage, but to give it a moment of silence, a pause in its service, as if even the softest voices need time to rest. And no one ever speaks much of the bell. No stories are told about it around the fire, and yet all who travel recognize it as more than just an object. It is a part of the caravan's breath, its heartbeat, the measure of its forward motion. And even on days when the winds are strong, and the dust flies, and voices must rise to be heard, the bell carries on, never loud, never lost, always reminding them that there is a way forward, that the road remains beneath them, and that even the slowest steps, if taken together, can sing. Worn by an old man who has walked behind the caravan longer than most can remember, whose name is spoken rarely, but always with a slight smile. The cloak is a patchwork of pieces stitched together over years, not by design or vanity, but by the slow accumulation of necessity and survival. Its edges frayed, the seams thick with uneven thread, and the colors faded into a spectrum of earth. Shades of baked ochre, bleached gray, soot black, dust tan, and occasional fragments of something once brighter, now dulled by time and sand. And this cloak, which billows slightly behind him when the wind catches it just right, is made not from silk or cotton of any fineness, but from leftover scraps, discarded cloth, torn sections of abandoned tent flaps, old saddle covers, and offerings from those who have traveled alongside him and moved on, or vanished, or returned home, each patch a silent gift, given without ceremony, and accepted without question, stitched in place with the same crooked needle he has carried since his youth, its eye now slightly bent, and its metal dark with the oil of his fingertips. And though no one asks what the cloak means, or why he has kept it together for so long, many have watched it move as he walks, fluttering in irregular waves that seem to carry with them stories never spoken, memories never named, as though the cloak itself is a tapestry of lost voices. And during moments of rest, when the camp grows still and the fire crackles low. The old man often spreads part of the cloak across his knees, pulling loose a few strands, rethreading the worn spots, humming quietly with the ease of someone who has done this more times than he's counted. And the younger travelers, especially those on their first long journey across the Silk Road, sometimes watch him from a distance, unsure whether to be curious or respectful, because the cloak, while humble, carries an undeniable gravity, like a weathered map drawn in thread instead of ink. And when the wind blows stronger, lifting its ends like a flag, the cloak rustles, not like new fabric, but like dry leaves, soft and brittle, whispering with the voices of years layered one atop another. And the old man never speaks of the cloak directly, never gestures to it, never draws attention to the pieces that hold it together. Yet everyone who travels near him senses that in its folds lies something more than warmth or shelter, something quietly sacred, a collection of forgotten places, campfires long extinguished, names no longer spoken, and when a new tear appears, as they inevitably do during a rough climb, or when brushing past thorny shrubs at the edge of a valley path, the man does not sigh or frown, but simply reaches for the pouch he keeps at his belt, removes his curved needle, and chooses a new piece from a bundle of saved fabric. And no one sees him measure or plan. He simply begins the repair, one stitch at a time, always crooked, always steady. And in this quiet ritual, there is a kind of dignity, not in craftsmanship or display, but in the way he refuses to let the cloak fall apart completely, in the way he carries his past without asking others to understand it. And so the cloak follows him like a shadow stitched from memory, moving with him by day, warming him by night, and bearing witness to a journey measured not in miles or trades, but in the accumulation of wind and weather and silence. And when others sleep, the cloak remains close to him, sometimes drawn over his shoulders, sometimes beneath his head, sometimes draped like a blanket across the sand. And even in the deepest hours, when the fire is only ash and the moon hides behind a bank of clouds, it is possible to glimpse the shape of the cloak shifting slightly in the dark, rising and falling with the man's breath, a soft silhouette against the earth, as if the road itself had curled around him for warmth. As midday inches toward the horizon and the pale sun rides higher in a sky bleached nearly white by the thin air and endless light, the caravan begins to cross one of the long, flat salt plains that stretch like silver mirrors across the desert floor, a vast, level stretch of land where no trees grow, no birds call, and the earth, parched and cracked into irregular puzzle pieces, reflects the sky so cleanly that for a moment it becomes difficult to tell where the world ends and the sky begins. And across this luminous stillness, the caravan's shadow stretches out like a long, dark ribbon unraveling behind them, rippling slightly with each step of the camels, each shift of a pack, each sway of a cloth. The shadow, not a single shape, but a collection of quiet silhouettes. Men wrapped in cloaks and turbans, camels lurching under the weight of woven baskets and water skins, women balancing sleeping children on hips wrapped in long cloths, and figures too far to name or count, all casting reflections that drift behind them like ghosts, and the salt beneath them crunches softly, not like sand, but like thin ice, brittle and delicate, releasing a soft hiss with every step, as if the land is sighing under their weight, though it has borne travelers like this for centuries, and no one speaks much during this part of the journey, not because of any rule, but because the landscape itself seems to request silence, to press gently against the ears and chest with its sheer emptiness, its vastness so complete that even a whispered word might sound too loud, too sudden. And so the group moves quietly, their shapes drawn out in the bright sun, their shadows growing longer as the afternoon progresses, flowing across the cracked salt like ink poured into invisible channels, threading between rocks and dried pools, never quite catching up, but always staying close, and some glance at their own shadows, now and then, amused by how tall they seem, how bent and stretched and foreign they appear in the reflection, as if the road has turned them into something new, something thinner and quieter than before. And for a few moments, they almost believe the shadows move on their own, that they carry memories, or warnings, or stories unspoken, trailing behind, not just this caravan, but every caravan that has ever passed this way, stretching back through time like an unbroken procession of soft footsteps and long, thoughtful silences. And as the sun dips just slightly, enough to soften the glare, the wind picks up from the east and skims along the surface of the salt, carrying a faint scent of something mineral and clean, as if the plain itself remembers the sea it once was, long ago, before it turned dry and white, and the camels snort and grunt, but keep moving, their shadows swaying beside them like tired companions, while the people walk in lines or small clusters, hands occasionally touching to adjust a strap or share a skin of water, but always with eyes drifting outward, to the edge where the plain meets the air and blurs into nothing, and no one asks how much farther they must walk today, because the plain gives no clues, no markers, no changes, only the same mirrored earth and the same distant shimmer that never arrives. And when they finally stop, hours later, the shadows lengthen even more, stretching almost impossibly long across the flat earth, like dark flags planted in silence, and the caravan gathers in a loose circle once again, their backs to the sun, their shadow still moving just a little, still echoing the journey even in rest. And for a while, as they kneel to eat or sip from skins or unroll mats, they glance back at the plain they crossed and see only themselves, not in mirrors, but in silhouettes, a procession of travelers that, for a brief time, seemed as permanent as the land beneath them. When the caravan finally halts for rest after many quiet hours beneath the indifferent brightness of the sky, there is no rush, no barked command or flurry of movement, only the steady rhythm of unloading, the soft thud of packs and saddles meeting, the ground the size of camels kneeling into the warm crust of the earth, and the shared, wordless understanding that this stop, like the 100 before it, is not merely a pause in travel, but a small unfolding ritual, and from within the bundles carried atop the driest camels, wrapped in oilskin and nestled between softer cloths to keep them from crumbling, come the flat, round loaves of travel bread, discs of flour, salt, and water, baked hard and thin, with edges slightly cracked and surfaces browned with flecks of ash from the morning's fire before last. And they are not sliced, nor divided with tools, but torn slowly by hand, the crust giving way with a quiet rip, the inner part soft and slightly chewy, tasting faintly of smoke, and the air of every campfire where the dough once rose under stars. And the tearing of the bread is not ceremonial, but it carries a rhythm that feels ancient, the way each person passes a piece to the next without counting, without weighing, simply knowing by instinct and memory how much is enough. And sometimes it is dipped in oil, if any remains, or in crushed herbs stored in small pouches made of woven grass. But most often it is eaten plain, chewed slowly, not for flavor or indulgence, but for sustenance and the quiet comfort of a familiar act. And those gathered do not sit in rows or circles with any formality, but settle where they are, in clusters formed by shadow and shade, by habit or kinship or ease, kneeling or cross-legged on mats that hold the imprint of dozens of such meals. And between bites, they do not speak much, for the weariness of the day still clings to their shoulders, and the silence of the salt plain still lingers in their throats, so that even laughter, if it comes, arrives softly, more like a hum than a song, and sometimes, between the tearing and chewing and swallowing, there is a moment when a small piece of bread is held out without a word, to a child too tired to ask, to a stranger who joined the caravan only days before, to a guide with a cut on his palm from yesterday's stone path. And in that moment, the bread becomes more than food. It becomes proof that even in this vast, indifferent landscape, where the wind knows no names and the sun offers no shelter, there is still a thread of care, a fragile but enduring promise that no one will be forgotten. And when the meal is done, the last crumbs brushed from palms, the broken loaves wrapped again in cloth to be carried forward, the travelers do not thank one another aloud, for that too is understood. Instead, they lean back against the slope of their packs, or lie with cloaks over their eyes, or stare up at the still blazing sky, where birds are rare, and clouds rarer, and for a time, the air grows quiet again, filled only with the steady breath of resting bodies and the occasional creak of leather adjusting under its own weight. And in that quiet, the memory of the bread lingers, not the taste, but the gesture, the way it was torn and shared, as though the road itself had offered something small and warm and human, just for a moment, before asking them to rise again and keep walking, set gently in the center of a cloth mat woven from camel hair and faded reeds, between sleeping bags that still hold the warmth of resting bodies, and beside the folded corner of a leather-bound map, a simple bowl of water rests as still as breath, held before a question, its rim chipped from the road and its surface undisturbed, catching the light not with flash or shimmer, but with a quiet conviction. And in this bowl, shallow and stained by time, there is no magic, no ritual, no marked sacredness, yet all who pass it pause, if only for a moment, as if drawn by something just outside the realm of thought, because in the silence that comes once the wind has stilled and the animals have laid down, and the last ember has given up its glow. That little bowl begins to do what no map or compass can. It shows the sky, not the full arc of it, not the stars in their wide procession, or the moon in her grandeur, but a small, curved piece, just enough to remind the watcher of distance and stillness at the same time. And the water within is not cold, not fresh from a spring or filtered from a stream, but carried for hours in a skin that smells faintly of hide and dust, poured with care by a woman whose hands have cupped more water than most have tasted, her fingers steady even when the ground wobbled beneath them, and the bowl remains untouched for long stretches, not because it is forgotten, but because no one wishes to disturb it. Not the merchant who once traded silk for silver, not the boy who ran laughing through the dunes just before dusk, not the woman who hummed softly to her daughter while braiding her hair by firelight. They all see it, and somehow they all know to leave it. And sometimes, when the wind moves just so, a single grain of sand drifts into the bowl and sinks without sound, like a thought sinking into sleep, barely shifting the reflection. And what the bowl shows is never grand, the arc of a single star, the edge of a moon not yet full, the fade of night's color from indigo to ash, or simply the tremble of stillness itself. And for the few who gaze into it long enough, it begins to feel as if the sky has been drawn closer, that all the vastness has bent down just slightly, just enough to be cupped in a handmade dish. And as the night stretches further and the air cools, the reflection in the bowl shifts, not with motion, but with presence. And for those half asleep on their mats, or wrapped in cloaks, watching from the corners of their dreams, the bowl becomes not a vessel, but a companion, a quiet reminder that even here, far from cities, far from towers and gates and temples, something watches back, not a god or a spirit, but the sky itself, patient and wide and slow. And before anyone drinks from the bowl, for eventually, of course, someone must, they pause again, one hand reaching out, fingers hovering, hesitant not from superstition, but from a kind of reverence. And the water, when lifted in the palm and brought to the lips, tastes as it always does, slightly dusty, faintly warm, but enough. And though no one speaks of the bowl afterward, it is rinsed and placed down again at the same spot at the edge of the map near the corner of the resting place, waiting not to be used, but to reflect, to hold what cannot be carried, to catch the sky each time it leans low enough to be seen, hung from the topmost curve of a slender wooden pole, driven carefully into the packed desert floor near the edge of the resting circle, not in the center, where warmth and food and voices cluster, but slightly apart, where shadow blends into silence. The lantern gives off a gentle, flickering light, not bright enough to read by, not bold enough to chase back the dark, but just enough to mark a boundary between night and not night, to keep the edge of the world visible while everything else falls slowly away. And the lantern itself is simple, its frame made of bent brass dulled with ash and sweat, its panels of thin, wavy glass held in place by wire, twisted so many times it feels like memory rather than metal. And inside, A flame the size of a thumb dances atop a stub of wax that leans slightly to one side, like it too has grown tired from the long journey, and the man who lit it did so with slow movements, not because he was weary, though he was, but because the act itself demanded slowness, as if quickness would somehow offend the quiet that had settled over the camp. He struck the flint with a soft rasp, caught the spark in a wisp of wool, and fed it to the waiting wick with the patience of someone who knows that light, like trust, cannot be rushed. And now, long after the others have laid their heads down, after the last of the tea has been drunk, and the fire reduced to a whisper of coals, the lantern still sways gently in the wind, casting a narrow pool of golden light that quivers across the sand like a reflection of someone walking far away, and beneath that light, small things become visible. A thread caught on a saddle buckle, the faint scrape of a scorpion's trail near the edge of a mat, the blurred shape of a footstep left by someone who had risen briefly in the dark, then returned to rest. And above the lantern, the sky stretches wide and indifferent, the stars unblinking in their cold clarity. Yet below, this tiny flame continues to exist, not defiant, not brave, but simply present, a quiet insistence that the darkness need not be complete, and those who sleep nearby do so more easily because of it, not because it keeps them safe in any practical way, but because it signals that someone thought to place it there, to place it there. Someone cared enough to give the night a soft edge, and when the wind blows stronger, the flame bends and flickers, but never goes out, its movement more like breathing than burning, as if the lantern itself is resting. And sometimes, long after midnight, a figure may rise and walk past it, cloaked and half asleep, heading toward the camels or the dunes, and the lantern will cast its gentle light across their shoulder, offering no questions, only company. And eventually, the wax will run low, the wick will draw its last breath, and the flame will shrink into a glowing ember, curl into itself, and vanish with no fanfare, leaving behind a trace of warmth in the glass, a memory of its light. And yet, by morning, someone will clean the soot from the chimney, replace the wick, trim the brass, and set it aside once more, not because it is necessary, but because the quiet of the night deserves a companion and a single lantern. Burning just enough is all that it asks, tucked deep within a felt pouch, the color of smoke, tied shut with a length of fraying cord, and nestled in the folds of a worn leather belt. The coins rest without ceremony or shine, their surfaces dulled by sand and time, their edges softened by the touch of countless hands that once passed them across rugs, tables, scales, and palms. And though they rarely leave their pouch, rarely ring against each other with the clink of transaction or the urgency of need, their presence is constant, not as a tool of trade, but as a quiet reassurance, a silent promise carried not for wealth, but for peace. And the man who wears the belt, a middle-aged trader with a slow smile and a careful way of moving, never counts the coins aloud, never opens the pouch for show, but touches it now and then as he walks, not to check its contents, but to remind himself that he is still moving forward, still part of the long, winding thread that is the Silk Road, still trusted enough to carry something of value, and the coins, mismatched and worn, come from many places, some minted in cities with gates of polished stone, others cast in villages so small their names have slipped from maps, their designs faded into near anonymity, a bird here, a star there, a faint outline of a ruler's profile barely visible under centuries of travel and heat. And though their buying power shifts from region to region, and some merchants demand beads or bolts of cloth instead, the weight of these coins remains universal, not in the marketplace, but in the mind, grounding their bearer in a quiet truth that something endures even when languages, landscapes, and companions change. And during breaks in travel, when the group rests beneath the sparse shade of a stone outcrop or beside the narrow bank of a slow-moving stream, the pouch may be untied, not for trade, but for familiarity, the trader lifting out a single coin and rolling it between thumb and forefinger, not studying it, not admiring it, simply letting the metal cool his skin, letting the memory of where it came from settle over him like the lightest cloak. And those nearby rarely ask about the coins, though they notice, of course, the way the man sometimes smooths the pouch with his hand before sleep, the way he presses it gently against his chest before tucking it beneath his mat. And they understand, without speaking, that the pouch is not guarded with fear, but with affection, as one might guard a letter from a distant friend, or the dried petals of a flower given long ago. And when the road grows long, and the horizon stretches empty for hours, when the only sounds are the creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic breath of camels, the coins feel heavier, not from burden, but from presence, as if they too are walking, keeping pace inside the pouch, humming softly in their metallic silence. And when, rarely, a coin is traded, handed over for salt or almonds, or a night's place by a stranger's fire, the trader selects it slowly, running his fingers over the faded surfaces, choosing not the least valuable, but the one most ready to leave, the one that feels like it wants to move on. And the pouch, ever so slightly lighter, is tied again and returned to the belt. Its emptiness, not a loss, but a continuation. For in a world where so much changes, faces, skies, languages, directions, the coins remain, waiting, resting, witnesses to a journey measured not in wealth, but in the sound of footsteps and the quiet weight of things worth keeping, built not in haste, nor with the precision of an artisan's bench, but through repeated gestures, habitual choices, and the quiet wisdom passed down between those who spend more of their lives walking than standing still. The camel's saddle is neither beautiful nor particularly symmetrical, yet it is perfect for its purpose, formed from wood that has been softened by sun and sweat and shaped over time to the slope of the camel's back, wrapped in thick bands of knotted rope that bite into the grain of the frame and hold everything together like promises too old to break. And beneath this structure, layered carefully one over the other, are the thick woolen pads that carry the hidden story of the journey, coarse and tangled, but softened with use. They speak not through words, but through texture, each layer holding the imprint of 100 days of travel, the weight of trade goods, the sway of motion, the occasional jostle of uneven terrain. And though they are rarely seen, except by those who prepare the animals each morning. These pads are where memory resides, pressed into folds and seams, warmed by breath and sun and silence. And the man who tends this particular saddle, whose hands know the feel of leather and wool better than they know ink or coin, wakes before the others to adjust the straps, check the binding knots, run his fingers across the underside for stones or burrs or wear, because he knows that even the smallest irritation, unnoticed in haste, will deepen over miles into a wound, into limp, into pause. And so he lifts the pads gently, brushes them out, repositions them until they lie just right, not flat, not straight, but right. And only then does he set the wooden frame down, lashing it with methodical ease onto the camel's broad back, whispering a few words to the animal, not commands, not praise, but familiar syllables that mean everything and nothing. And the camel, long accustomed to this dance, stands steady, blinking slowly in the rising sun, its breath steaming slightly in the morning air, as the pads press into its back with the pressure of continuity. And as the caravan moves out and the sun climbs higher, the saddle holds steady, bearing its burden without protest, creaking gently in rhythm with each step, and beneath it, the layers of wool shift imperceptibly, adapting to the movement of the road, absorbing the rhythm of the earth, collecting the day's heat and dust. And when the evening finally comes and the packs are lifted off, the saddle removed, the woolen layers spread out to air beneath, the open sky, they carry the scent of the day, sweat, dust, warm wood, and something faintly green from where the camel brushed past a patch of hardy desert grass. And though no one leans close to smell them or speak of them aloud, everyone who sees them understands these are not just padding, not just functional cloth. They are the quiet record of the journey, of distance passed, of weight borne, of paths taken and retaken. And when they are rolled up again and stacked beside the resting beast, they do not rest in sleep, but in readiness, waiting for the morning to come, for the saddle to return, and for the road to continue beneath them once more. In the bottom of a carved wooden box, no larger than a folded scarf, nestled between two tightly bound scrolls of flaxen parchment and wrapped in a strip of silk that once served as a headband, rests a small clay inkwell sealed with a cork softened by time and stained with the evidence of repeated use. And though the ink inside is dark, nearly black, its hue carries the quiet echo of distant berries and burnt wood, the crushed remains of plants gathered far from here, some grown on riverbanks where boats drift lazily in warm seasons, others dried in desert winds, then boiled down to thick pigment by hands now long gone. And this ink, though unseen for most of the journey, has accompanied the caravan across borders and mountain passes, through language barriers and forgotten villages, always resting in that humble box that smells of dust and resin and the paper it has stained. And the man who carries it is not a scribe by trade, not a poet or scholar, but a merchant with a habit of noting things, a way of recording not just debts and deliveries, but the subtler movements of the world. A cloud formation above the Taklamakan, a peculiar way a stranger greeted him in a tea tent, the song a herder sang to his goats at dawn, And each evening, after the meal is finished and the fire is dying down, he unrolls one scroll and removes the cork with care, dabbing a thin brush made from a reed and the hair of a mountain hare into the inkwell, watching the bristles darken like twilight slipping across a lake, and with slow, deliberate strokes, he writes in lines that flow from right to left, sometimes curling back on themselves like drifting vines. And though no one reads over his shoulder, some glance at his face as he writes, noting the softness in his eyes, the way his lips occasionally move with the rhythm of the words, though no sound escapes. And what he writes may never be read aloud, may never cross the eyes of another traveler or merchant or judge, and yet he writes each word with the care of someone who believes that the act itself is enough, that to record a thing is to give it weight, to let it settle instead of vanish. And when the ink runs low, as it inevitably does, he does not lament or seek replacement in the next market, for he knows how to stretch what remains, how to dip less deeply, how to blot the tip and still make it sing. And on nights when the wind is strong and the lantern flutters and sand whispers through the seams of the tents, he writes more slowly, steadying the page with his other hand, the ink drying slightly thicker under the dry breath of the desert. And when he finishes, when the scroll is rolled back tight and the ink sealed away, he holds the brush for a moment longer, as if listening for some echo within it, then wraps it again and places it into the wooden box, his hand lingering on the lid before closing it. And that ink, once dried, becomes part of the road itself, part of the record that won't be carried in trade, but in memory, in the creases of paper that will one day be unfolded and puzzled over, long after the merchant has returned home or wandered on. And so the ink, though it never speaks, never shouts, travels farther than most voices, crossing borders and years, its words soaked not just into parchment, but into the rhythm of the road, where every curve of script becomes a step, every line a mile, and every blot the soft mark of something real, something once felt, resting now in silence, tucked beneath a folded shawl at the bottom of a wide, lopsided sack, whose seams have been repaired more times than anyone remembers, lies a smaller cloth pouch, soft and faded, the color of earth after rain, tied with a braided cord frayed on one side and closed with the sort of knot that takes patience to open. And within that modest bag, hidden away from dust and the sun's heat, is a collection of dried fruit, not arranged or preserved for display, but carried along like a quiet offering to oneself, a reminder of sweetness on long, salt-bitten days, slices of fig with skin, like paper, strips of apricot curled into themselves, dates dark as ink and sticky to the touch, and even a few slivers of quince, still holding the ghost of a fragrance that once filled the courtyard where they were peeled and left out under a net to dry. And though the trader who carries them rarely eats more than a piece or two in a day, the pouch is always close, placed near his sleeping roll or nestled against the side of the pack animal that bears his most personal things. And when the caravan pauses in the late afternoon, before the light begins to tilt and the air grows cool again, he will sometimes sit alone beneath a low tree or beside a hummock of rock, and untie the pouch with slow, familiar fingers. Not because he is hungry, but because the act of choosing a single piece, of holding it in his palm and remembering where it came from, is as nourishing as the bite itself. And as he chews, slow and quiet, his eyes often close just slightly, not in sleep, but in thought, tasting not only the fruit, but the memory it carries. A boy's laugh across a terrace, a metal bowl clinking as it's set down, the heavy buzz of bees above a vine-covered wall. And he does not rush, does not finish one piece and move to the next, for each one is both food and story, both flavor and silence. And sometimes, when the journey has been especially long, or the trade especially lean, he will reach deeper into the pouch and feel, not for fruit, but for the other small things hidden within. A smooth stone from a mountain trail where snow still lingered, a folded scrap of cloth that once lined a gift box, a copper pin with no matching fastener, a bit of string that held something once valuable, now forgotten. And none of these things have weight in the market or use in the camp. Yet he keeps them all, not from sentimentality, but from habit, from a quiet reverence for objects that have simply remained. And when he repacks the pouch, tying the knot once more, pressing the air out gently before slipping it back into the sack, there is a calm that settles over him, not pride or pleasure, but the stillness that comes from holding a piece of the past in the palm of one's hand and allowing it to rest there without explanation. And though no one asks what he carries in that worn little bag, some notice the way he handles it, the care in his fingers, the faint smile that sometimes lingers on his face after it's tucked away again. And as the caravan gathers to move on, and the sun begins to stretch their shadows long and thin across the packed road, the trader joins them without hurry, walking quietly, the pouch now resting beneath other bundles once more, its contents gently shifting with each step, a soft reminder that even in the most practical of lives, there is always space for small, quiet sweetness that asks nothing, changes nothing, but remains long after the fire has quieted to a low orange breath, and most of the travelers have drawn their cloaks tighter around their shoulders, not from fear, but from the creeping coolness that settles after sundown. The wind begins to move again, not arriving in a rush or storm, but slipping in like a thought that comes unbidden in the stillness of half-sleep, whispering its way around bedrolls and down the spines of canvas tents, brushing across sleeping cheeks with the same indifference it shows to rocks, dunes, and the bones of forgotten animals scattered miles from any path. And it is not a fierce wind, not the kind that lifts grit and lashes skin, or howls through narrow passes with a voice like anger, but a gentler force, one that curls low to the ground, running fingers along the ridges of sand and stone, lifting the edges of maps left open too long, rattling the corners of woven mats, and tugging slightly at ropes, tied hastily after supper. It is the kind of wind that doesn't seem to come from anywhere, that doesn't belong to morning or night, to valley or plain, but that simply is as much a part of the road as the stones worn smooth by footfall, or the grooves in the wooden wheels of carts that have passed this way for centuries. And for those still awake, lying on their backs and watching the stars pulse in the clean black above, the wind feels almost like a memory, not of something specific, but of motion itself, the sensation of travel distilled into air, brushing the skin with the softest reminder that nothing ever truly stops on the Silk Road, not even in sleep, and it moves through hair, through sleeves, under collars, through the tiny tears in blankets patched too many times, through the hanging folds of clothing draped on sleeping camels, through the open mouths of travelers who breathe it in without thinking, unaware that they are drawing in the same wind that touched the robes of monks in distant mountains and cooled the brows of soldiers guarding lonely outposts, and the wind carries nothing distinct, no scent of water or spice or fire, only the faint, dry scent of distance, a smell that is not unpleasant but difficult to name, like old cloth warmed by sun, or the inside of a closed room when it's opened at last to air, and it moves as if it is listening, curling between those who dream and those who do not, rustling reeds that have been laid to sleep on, turning the sand into tiny ripples that will be gone by morning. And sometimes it lifts something small, a strand of thread, a fig stem, a curl of parchment, too light to resist, and carries it a few feet, then drops it without purpose, not out of cruelty or randomness, but simply because that is what the wind does. And though it never rests, it also never lingers, never becomes more than a presence, just barely there, like breath on the back of a neck, gone before it is understood. And when at last it slows again, fading into stillness as silently as it came, the travelers do not speak of it the next day, for it is not a thing worth remarking on, not an event or disruption, just the wind, the same wind that moved through the tents of their grandparents, and will move again through the sleeping quarters of their children, and so it is forgotten in the way that only the most constant things can be forgotten, folded back into the rhythm of the journey, like a heartbeat into the silence of sleep, in a dented brass kettle with a handle wrapped in linen, stained by years of smoke and steam, set upon 3 carefully balanced stones that cradle it over a nest of embers, no longer red, but glowing from deep within. The water begins to bubble, not with urgency, but with the slow, almost polite rhythm of something long practiced, long understood, and beside the fire, hunched slightly forward with a shawl draped over one shoulder and sand crusted lightly on the soles of his feet, sits the man who always makes the tea, not because he is the most skilled or most eager, but because no one else does. And over time this small evening task has become his, a gesture of consistency in a life where everything else shifts from one camp to the next, and the tea itself is simple, a handful of leaves stored in a tiny, rusted tin that rattles like a forgotten memory when shaken, some crushed cardamom wrapped in a square of old paper, and the last slivers of dried root scraped from the bottom of a cloth pouch that once held enough for a month. Nothing extravagant, nothing fragrant enough to draw comment from a visitor, but enough to warm the belly, to give the night a flavor other than dust and fatigue, and when the kettle sighs, sending up a faint plume of steam that catches the firelight like breath made visible, he pours the water in slow, steady circles over the ingredients in a cracked clay pot that has traveled so far it might now be more road than vessel, and then he waits, not timing it by clock or measure, but by feel, by the way the scent shifts, deepens, becomes heavier in the air. And those nearby know that when the scent begins to drift, that dry, almost smoky smell of oversteeped herbs and scorched sweetness, it is time to gather, not with conversation or ceremony, but in quiet proximity, mats pulled closer, hands extended not to take, but simply to be near. And when he pours the tea, he does not look up or ask who wants it, because he already knows who will reach out, who will wait, who will sip slowly, and who will let it cool before lifting the cup. And the cups themselves are unmatched, some chipped, some faintly cracked, one made from half a gourd, polish smooth from use, and each is handed over with a brief glance, a moment of contact that says more than words. And the tea, once tasted, is never quite the same each night. Sometimes a bit bitter, sometimes flat, occasionally touched with an aftertaste of whatever the herbs had rested beside. Leather, dried fish, damp fabric, but none of that matters, because what the tea offers is not perfection, but presence, a heat that travels from tongue to chest to fingertips, a ritual that wraps the body in something slow and grounding, and though no one says it aloud, each sip feels like a kind of remembering, a return to something unspoken but necessary, the way a road returns to itself no matter how far it twists. And long after the cups are empty and set gently beside sleeping mats, their bottoms still holding the ghost of warmth, the scent of the tea lingers, not strong, not sharp, but soft, like the breath of someone sleeping nearby. And in that scent is the comfort of repetition, of knowing that tomorrow, when the sun drops low and the day begins to cool, the tea will be made again, and whether it is better or worse, stronger or weaker, no one will ask, because that is not what matters. What matters is that it will be there, and in its quiet bitterness, it will carry with it the promise of rest. In the upper corner of one of the larger tents, where the woven cloth curves slightly inward before meeting the central post, forming a kind of shallow slope that rustles faintly when the wind moves across it, there is a single stitch that has been repaired so many times it is no longer a single stitch at all, but a quiet tangle of threads from different places and different days, a patchwork of intentions held together not by strength, but by repetition, and each time it was mended, whether by the older woman with strong fingers who hums as she sews, or the quiet boy who once pricked his finger and bled a little onto the fabric, or the visiting trader who insisted he knew the best way to reinforce canvas against a storm. The thread chosen was whatever was closest at hand, brown wool from a sock with no pair, faded red silk from the corner of a fraying scarf, a length of camel-colored yarn pulled from the hem of a blanket too short to matter. And so the repaired stitch grew in layers, not neat, but sure, each addition a whispered statement that the tent must hold, must endure just one more night, one more camp, one more storm, or wind-borne dustfall, until it became a kind of quiet monument to the road's persistence, a knot that tells a story in silence, and though it is tucked high above, where most eyes rest, Those who know the tent will glance at it from time to time, especially in moments of stillness, their gaze drifting upward as if to confirm that yes, the repair is still there, still doing its quiet work. And during storms, when the wind pulls at the seams and the ropes creak under strain, someone always checks it, reaching up with a gentle hand, pressing their palm to the patch to feel for movement, and often murmuring something under their breath, not a prayer, not a superstition exactly, but something between the two. And when the wind dies down and the night returns to calm, the patch is forgotten again, not out of neglect, but because it has done what it was meant to do. It held, and in the mornings, when the tent flap is lifted and the light spills in like warm water, it catches on that small tangle of thread, making the colors glow briefly before fading back into shade. And sometimes a child will ask about it, pointing upward with small fingers and wide eyes, and the answer is always gentle. That's the part that keeps us dry, or that's the part that remembers every night we've spent here, or simply, that's the part we fixed. And the child, satisfied, turns away, and so the stitch remains, not invisible, but quietly revered, never cut out or replaced, because those who travel the Silk Road know that strength does not come from perfection, but from care, from the willingness to tend something over and over again until it lasts. And as the days pass, and the tent is folded and unfolded, raised and lowered in different places under different skies, that small repair goes with it, like a traveling companion of thread and intention, holding together not just the fabric, but the memory of every night it stood between a sleeper and the sky, wrapped in a piece of faded blue linen and kept inside the side pocket of a canvas satchel that rarely leaves its owner's side. The spoon is not silver or bronze, not decorative or shaped for display, but simply carved from olive wood long ago, its bowl slightly lopsided from repeated use, and its handle worn smooth in places where generations of fingers have rested. And though many things are traded, lost, broken, or left behind on the Silk Road, this spoon remains, carried not for utility alone, but for what it holds beyond shape and function. And the man who carries it now, quiet and deliberate, inherited it from his mother, who received it from her father, a man who once traveled this same road with a smaller caravan, who dipped the spoon into the same kinds of stew, lifted the same texture of lentils and rice to his lips, wiped it clean with cloth, and tucked it away each evening with the same care, never thinking that a simple eating tool would outlast so many other belongings. And now, in the evenings when the fires are lit low and the stew simmers in the iron pot beside the tea kettle, this man unwraps the cloth slowly, not for drama, but for respect, letting the scent of the linen rise into the cool air as the spoon is revealed, its grain darkened with oil and time, its presence familiar not only to him, but to those who share the fire and have seen him use it night after night without fail. And when he dips it into the pot, the spoon moves with a kind of rhythm, not hurried, not mechanical, but almost like an extension of breath, as though eating is not just about hunger, but about remembering, about repeating something done by hands that are long gone, across fires long extinguished, and those who eat with him do not ask about it every night, but once in a while, someone new might inquire, and he'll explain softly, not in a speech, but in a few words. It was my mother's, and before that, her father's, and that is all, because the story is not in the telling, but in the holding, and sometimes, on especially cold nights, when the stew is thin and the bread harder than usual, he'll pause before lifting the spoon to his mouth, gazing into the bowl, as if expecting to see a reflection, not of his own face, but of someone older, someone who once sat on a similar patch of earth, with the same stars above, and the cloth it is wrapped in, once part of a headscarf worn during a windstorm many years ago, is as much a part of the ritual as the spoon itself, for when the fire has dimmed and the meals are finished, and the last of the coals glow like hidden embers of memory, he folds the spoon back into the cloth with slow hands, tucking in the corners, like a parent settling a child to sleep. And when the time comes to pack and move, it returns to the pocket of the satchel, nestled between a worn knife and a pouch of dried figs, never in the main compartment, never pressed under heavy things, but carried lightly and always within reach. And perhaps one day, though he does not say it aloud, the spoon will pass again to someone younger who watches how it's used and how it's kept, and who will learn, not from instruction, but from observation, that some objects are not sacred because of what they are made of, but because of what they have witnessed. And so each time the spoon dips, each time it rises to someone's mouth, it does more than feed. It remembers, at the very edge of the fire's reach, where the glow turns from gold to the softest orange, and the warmth still touches, but no longer insists, there sits a small iron pot, darkened with soot and time, its round belly mottled from years of being, set into flame and pulled back just before bubbling, and inside it, not yet steaming, but already fragrant, water infused with a pinch of dried mint, a sliver of ginger, and the faint trace of last night's leaves still clinging to the memory of being steeped. And this pot, unlike the ones used to cook grains or stews or soften beans, has only one task, and it performs it slowly, deliberately, waiting beside the coals while conversations fade and stars sharpen above, holding its heat not with urgency, but with patience, as if it knows that boiling is not the point, that the value lies in the anticipation, in the ritual of watching and waiting, and the man who tends it rarely stirs, or pokes, or lifts the lid, but sits a short distance away, his posture relaxed, his eyes half closed, listening not for the hiss or rumble of boiling, but for the rhythm of the fire and the subtle change in scent that comes when the water is just about to transform, and those who pass by or pause nearby instinctively lower their voices, as if the tea is listening too, as if too much noise might disturb the quiet perfection of this moment just before readiness. And often, someone will ask if the tea is ready, and the answer, always the same, is given with a faint smile and a slight tilt of the head, almost, not in frustration, but in comfort, because almost means it's coming, that warmth is near, that the night is not yet over, and the pot, though it has no markings or decorations, no maker's stamp or distinctive shape is known to everyone in the caravan, because every night it reappears in a new camp, beside a new fire, waiting once again to almost boil. And when, on some evenings, the wind picks up and the flame flickers low, the pot may cool just slightly, pulling back from the edge of readiness, and no one rushes it. No one adds more wood or shields it from the breeze. They let it continue as it is, understanding that there is peace in the slowness, that the act of making tea here is not about quenching thirst, but about inviting calm. And when the bubbles finally begin to gather along the edge, slow and deliberate like the start of distant thunder, the man will move only then, lifting the pot, not with haste, but with care, tilting it so the liquid slides smoothly into small cups without handles, made of thick clay that holds the heat without protest. And the scent rises, mint first, then earth, then something faintly sweet, and the cups are passed from hand to hand, never full, never scalding, but warm enough to be felt through skin and into the bones. And after the first sips, there is often no speaking, only the sound of tea being breathed in, the fire gently exhaling its last sparks, and someone far off humming a tune too soft to follow. And when the pot is emptied, wiped, and set aside, no one remarks on it, no one insists it was perfect, and yet everyone knows it was, because in that long, quiet moment, just before boiling, just before tea becomes tea, the road itself seems to rest, the night seems to lean closer, and even time appears to pause, listening, folded neatly at the foot of a reed mat that has been used so many nights, it carries the shape of the man who sleeps on it. The blanket rests quietly in the glow of the final embers, its edges curled slightly from being rolled and unrolled, wrapped and unwrapped, used and reused over more miles than can be counted. And though it is not especially thick nor finely woven, it is the blanket he reaches for every night, the one he tucks under his chin and folds over his knees and pulls over his shoulders when the desert air grows colder than expected, not because it is the warmest, but because it smells like every place he has ever stopped, and the scent, though soft, is always there, a mingling of sun-dried wool, faint smoke from dozens of different fires, the spice of cumin from a spilled parcel, a trace of cedar from where it once lay near a bundle of carved boxes, and the subtle earthiness that comes from being folded against the same clothes, the same mat, the same body, night after night. And when he presses his face into it, eyes already half closed, the memories return not in clear images, but in feelings, the sharp cold of a mountaintop stop, where snow kissed the hem of his robe, the soft, humid warmth of a river camp, where the fish sizzled over green wood and the bugs hummed all night, the dry heat of an afternoon where no shade could be found, and he lay under it, sweating, yet comforted, and all of those moments live now in the weave of the blanket, as if it has stored them, layer upon layer, like pages in a book written without ink. And even though it has been patched in places, stitched with thread of mismatched color and thickness, the repairs only make it more familiar, each one telling a silent story. This tear came from a Thornbush, near Dunhuang. This corner was burned slightly when a spark leapt too far in the wind outside Kashgar. This edge, frayed from weeks of riding packed too tightly beside a sack of dried dates, and the others in the caravan, though they each have their own covers and cloths, recognize this one immediately, for it is not only used for warmth, but occasionally spread across the sand to serve as a place to sit, to rest, to share a meal, or a quiet moment under the stars. And sometimes, when someone is ill or weary, beyond the usual fatigue of the road, he offers the blanket without a word, knowing it will do more than protect against cold. It will offer something older, something settled, something known. And when it is returned, it is always folded with care, sometimes even pressed briefly to the lips or face as if in thanks. And during the rare times it rains, and the ground grows wet, and the wind carries the smell of dampness into the tents, the blanket is aired out, but never washed completely, never scrubbed of its scent, for to do so would be to erase what it has gathered, to strip it of the slow, steady collection of its journey. And when the time comes to pack up once more, the mat is rolled, the satchel is tied, and the blanket is folded last, with 2 precise turns and 1 tuck, then placed not at the bottom of the load, but near the top, easily reachable for the next night, because it is not just bedding, it is a continuation of every campfire, every sigh, every night of staring into blackness and listening to the shifting silence of the Silk Road. And even in sleep, when dreams wander and minds drift far from the body, the scent of the blanket stays close, a quiet thread back to the present, a reminder that wherever they are, whatever the stars look like tonight, they are still on the journey, and the blanket will remember every step with them. Resting atop a folded square of cloth that was once part of a merchant's tunic, the bowl sits near the center of the fire circle, a simple clay vessel with an uneven rim and a faint spiral etched into its base that can only be seen when it is completely clean and dry, something that rarely happens on the road. And though it is unremarkable to look at, neither glazed nor symmetrical, it has become one of the quiet constants of the caravan, passed gently from person to person, often without ceremony or speech, filled with lentils or rice or warm broth, and emptied with a kind of unspoken reverence that grows not from the richness of the food, but from the act of sharing something warm in the chill of the desert air. And its weight is familiar in the hand, light enough not to tire the wrist, but sturdy enough to feel like it belongs, like it has been shaped, not just by the potter's wheel, but by years of fingers smoothing its edges, rinsing it in shallow streams, setting it beside rocks to dry in the sun. And no one claims the bowl as their own, yet everyone recognizes it. And when it is their turn to hold it, they do so as if cradling something that remembers more than they do, something that has held 100 meals and 1,000 stories, told in low voices around low fires, while wind whispered against tent cloth and the sky pressed down like a great, soft lid over the camp. And it is not a large bowl, not deep enough to hold more than a modest scoop, and yet it always feels sufficient, as though the act of holding it fills more than the stomach, as if what is passed in that vessel is more about warmth and rhythm than nourishment. And sometimes, when the food runs especially low and the pot yields little, someone will laugh softly and say, just enough for the bowl, and indeed, there always is, just enough to give it purpose, to let it carry its weight from hand to hand once again, and when it is finally set down, empty, there is no scraping at its sides, no argument for more, only the quiet understanding that the bowl, though modest, has done its job, has been part of the ritual of being alive together on the Silk Road. And at night, when everything else is packed away, or hung up or stored beneath coverings, the bowl is left in the open air, usually upside down, near the coals that are now only a faint red pulse in the sand, and the cloth it sat on is folded and placed nearby, and neither are touched until morning, and if it rains, the bowl catches the first drops, holding them in its shallow heart until someone gently empties it and wipes it dry, as though even the sky has a role in filling it from time to time. And when a new traveler joins the group and the bowl is passed to them, they often pause, unsure whether to eat from it or simply hold it, and the others do not instruct them, but simply wait, knowing that the bowl will teach its own lesson, quietly, without words. And perhaps that is why it never breaks. Despite the rough roads, the falls and jostles, the shifting loads and unpredictable weather, perhaps it is held together not only by clay, but by memory, and by the quiet weight of hands that have treated it as more than an object. And so the bowl continues, day after day, night after night, always modest, always useful, and always ending up empty, not because it holds too little, but because it gives exactly enough, hanging from a wooden post that has been driven slightly off-center into the packed earth just beside the largest tent. The lantern is not particularly bright, nor is it designed for spectacle or signaling. It is an ordinary thing made of thin metal ribs that hold panes of cloudy glass, with one small door on a hinge that sometimes creaks when opened, but always closes with a soft click. And within it, a small oil flame dances, fueled by a wick trimmed short and dipped in oil that has soaked through the base of the chamber, burning not with fierceness, but with persistence, a flame that does not flicker wildly or flare up in sudden bursts, but glows with the kind of steadiness that soothes more than it illuminates. And the post it hangs from has long since warped slightly to one side from repeated pounding into rocky soil, and the weight of the lantern hanging in wind and rain, so that the lantern does not hang still, but gently tilts forward and backward, forward and backward, like a cradle pushed by a very old memory. And this motion, subtle as it is, makes the light inside bend and shift, stretch and contract, casting moving shadows that drift across the tent walls like slow dancers, like stories being told in silhouette for no audience in particular. And as the evening deepens into night, and the conversations fade into quiet, the lantern continues its small performance, never stopping, never demanding attention, simply offering the comfort of repetition, of rhythm, of a light that sways not because it must, but because the world around it breathes, and those who sleep near it do so more easily, lulled not by silence, but by that soft glow that reaches into their dreams, reminding them that someone thought to hang the lantern, someone filled it, someone lit it, and while they rest, the light moves across their closed eyelids, sometimes flickering as a moth passes, sometimes stretching long when the wind picks up and rocks the post more deeply, casting lines of gold across canvas and clay, and faces wrapped in cloth, and occasionally someone will wake, turn slightly, and see the shadow still swaying on the inside of their tent, and they'll exhale softly and close their eyes again, comforted not by what they see, but by the simple fact that it continues, that the lantern has not gone out, that the shadows still move, that the light still breathes, and even in storms, when the tents are lashed more tightly and the wind howls across the plain, the lantern's light continues to stretch and bend, sometimes dimming, sometimes flaring, but never extinguished, never lost. And in the mornings, when the sun begins to rise, and the light of the world shifts from golden to gray to soft blue, the lantern is gently extinguished with a careful breath and a twist of the wick, the little door creaking open again, releasing the last warm scent of burning oil into the cool air, and then it is left to rest, swinging still gently in the early morning wind, as if even without its light, it remembers its role, not to light the way, but to remind the weary that the darkness need not be empty, that something gentle can still move, still flicker, still dance, even in the quietest hours of the night, somewhere just beyond the fire's outermost warmth, in the space where soft darkness presses lightly against the backs of the tents, and the sounds of night begin to settle, like fine dust onto cloth and breath. A merchant kneels before a shallow, wooden crate lined with an old cloth that smells faintly of cardamom and distant hills, and with hands that know their work well, he begins to measure out grain, not with scales or marked tools, but by touch, by sound, by the delicate language of rhythm that only those who've spent a lifetime trading can fully speak. And though the others have mostly curled into sleep, some wrapped in blankets, others resting with their heads on folded arms, the sound of the grain pouring from sack to box, or from one cupped palm into another, floats gently into the air, like dry rain, a sound so soft it seems to mix with the very fabric of the night. And the grain is millet, small and pale and round, each piece no heavier than a breath. And yet when thousands of them slide against each other, they create a hush that resembles silk being pulled slowly through a ring or dry wind moving across a field. And the man moves with care, his motions unhurried, not from fatigue, but from respect, because in this small act of preparation, measuring what will be traded in the morning, there is an ancient dignity, a quiet acknowledgement that even in the darkness, even when no one watches, the rituals of exchange continue, and he does not count aloud, does not mark numbers with voice or chalk or knife tip, but instead watches the level of grain rise against the edges of the crate, knowing by the way it slopes whether he has given too much or too little, adjusting gently by feel, as though he is shaping not grain, but time itself. And when a breeze lifts the edge of his robe and brushes against the pile, the topmost grains shift just slightly, shimmering under starlight like pale sand on the edge of a tide, and he smiles, not disturbed, but appreciative of the air's small conversation, and occasionally he will pause to draw a finger through the grain, making patterns that vanish almost immediately, not because they hold meaning, but because motion brings comfort and sound brings peace, and the quiet tapping of seeds against wood, the rustle of the cloth beneath them, the soft rasp of his calloused fingers, all combine into a music that doesn't require ears, only presence. And the nearby camels do not stir, nor do the resting bodies of travelers shift, because the sound is not enough to wake, only enough to soften dreams. And when the measuring is complete, when the crate holds what it must, and the sack is tied once again with a loop of frayed rope that smells faintly of barley and wind, he sets the container gently aside, not stacking it or shoving it into place, but resting it with care, as if it were a vessel of something precious, which in its own way it is. And then, after brushing his hands together with a motion more meditative than practical, he sits back on his heels and looks up for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead in their patient rhythm, the only constant above a road that shifts daily beneath his feet. And in that moment, the grain, the box, the breath of night, and the quiet weight of silence become one. Not dramatic, not profound, but simply whole. And so he stays there a little while longer before finally rising, his knees crackling softly like firewood, and stepping slowly back toward the sleeping camp, leaving the crate of grain to wait under the moon's gaze until morning, just beyond the last tent, where the ground slopes slightly downward into a basin of soft sand scattered with round stones, smoothed by years of wind. A camel stands unmoving in the still night air, its thick eyelids drooped but not entirely closed, its long neck bent just enough to rest the weight of its head against the curve of its chest. And though from a distance it appears awake, alert even, perhaps watching the stars, or listening to the last whisper of fire crackling, it is, in fact, asleep, caught in that strange and ancient way camels have of dreaming while upright, legs locked, muscles relaxed without surrendering to gravity, as if the earth itself were holding it gently in place. And nearby, two others lie folded in the sand, legs tucked under, bellies pressed to the cool dust. But this one remains standing, its massive padded feet planted firmly, swaying only slightly with the faint wind that passes through the camp like a wandering thought. And every now and then, it exhales a low, wet breath through its thick lips, followed by a pause so long that even silence seems to lean closer to hear the next sound. And then it breathes again and again, at wide, uneven intervals that make the night feel even slower, as if measured not by time, but by breath. And those who know the ways of camels do not question this posture, do not wonder if the animal is restless or troubled, because they've seen it too many times. The camel who chooses to remain upright, eyes half-lidded, unmoving except for a twitch of the tail or a ripple along its broad side, as though it carries the burden of rest without ever laying it down. And some say this behavior comes from instinct, that in the wild they stood to guard the herd, that sleep did not mean vulnerability, but balance. And perhaps this is true, but there's something more in the stillness of this moment, something unspoken in the way its shadow rests long and solid against the ground, as if the darkness itself has leaned against the camel's shape for comfort. And overhead, the stars reflect faintly in the camel's dark eyes, glistening like tiny echoes of firelight too distant to warm. And though the animal does not blink often, when it does, it is slow, as if pushing away not a speck of dust, but a dream too light to hold. And sometimes, in the deep hush between midnight and dawn, one of the nearby travelers stirs and sees the camel's shape still upright, a silhouette against the lighter sky, and they might smile to themselves or pull their blanket tighter, reassured not just by the presence of a watchful beast, but by the continuity of it all, that while humans sleep, folded into fabric and shaped by dreams, the camel remains, ancient and unmoved, a kind of breathing pillar in the desert. And when the first blush of morning begins to edge the horizon and the other camels rise slowly, groaning and stretching and flicking sand from their legs, this one lowers its head slightly, lets its long lashes lift just once, and takes its first true step in hours, not as if waking, but as if continuing, something that never stopped. And no one remarks on it. No one notes that the camel was standing all night, because it is not unusual here, not strange or worth mentioning. It is simply part of the road's long rhythm, the way some fires burn without smoke, some pots boil without bubbles, and some creatures, shaped by the endless stretch of land and time, find their rest in stillness rather than softness. Near the rear of one of the older wagons, a slow-moving wooden cart with a sagging axle and wheels that creak softly even when still, there is a leather strap that loops tightly around a bundle of goods stacked low and bound snugly in faded linen. And though the strap is nothing special to look at, cracked in places, stained with oil and dust, its buckle slightly bent from years of tugging, it has become one of those small, trusted things that no one talks about, but everyone relies on, because somehow, despite its age and simplicity, it never fails to hold. And this particular strap has been with the caravan longer than most of the people, stretching and snapping back across deserts, mountains, riverbanks, and rainstorms, pulled tight across grain sacks, toolkits, tent bundles, and occasionally even wrapped around a load of firewood when no rope could be found. And though it has been untied and retied 1,000 times, threaded through buckles in the dark and tugged by cold fingers in the morning frost, it always seems to find its shape again, flattening into place like a memory returning to its original form. And when the wind picks up and loose, covers begin to flap, or a wooden slat starts to rattle in the cart, someone will often reach for that same strap, pull it taut again, and trust that whatever it is wrapped around will stay. And at night, when the carts are drawn into a rough circle and everything is still, the strap remains in place, holding its quiet weight without protest, resting without release. And the leather, darkened in some places and scuffed in others, tells a story of its own. The mark where a drop of ink once spilled during a scribe's hurried packing, the faint groove worn by a stone that nestled against it for weeks of travel, the slightly stiff patch that had frozen once during a snowy pass and thawed slowly by the fire. And there's a kind of comfort in its presence, a reassurance that some things do not need to be beautiful or new to be necessary, and occasionally someone will run their fingers across it while packing or waiting, not checking its strength, but simply feeling its texture, as if reminded of its reliability, and on nights when the camp feels particularly exposed, when there are strange sounds in the distance, or the air hangs heavy with the scent of something unfamiliar, that old strap becomes something more than a tool. It becomes a symbol, a line drawn against disorder, holding not just supplies, but a piece of peace, a thread of order in the soft chaos of the road, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when only a few embers glow, and the stars press low, and the cold begins to whisper at the edge of every blanket. The strap does its silent work, holding everything in place, not with drama, but with steadiness, like a promise made without words. And when the sun rises and the wagon creaks back to life, rolling forward one more day, the strap shifts a little, tightens with the jostle, and carries on, unnoticed again, but never unneeded. In one of the smaller tents near the eastern edge of the camp, where the wind slips in more easily and the light of the fire does not reach so boldly, a man leans over a low wooden tray set across his knees, his fingers steady despite the cold, as he dips a carved reed pen into a small ceramic pot of thick, black ink that smells faintly of soot and spice. And in the dimness, with only a hanging oil lamp casting flickering gold across the coarse cloth laid out before him, he begins to write, not on paper or parchment, which would be rare and far too precious for this kind of nightly reflection, but on a long flat strip of cloth that has been washed smooth by time and carefully stretched over a frame to keep its surface still. And the ink, slow to dry and slightly glossy, flows across the fibers in a way that feels more like breathing than writing, the letters forming one by one with the patience of someone who does not write for speed or acclaim, but because the act itself is a kind of peace, and the sound of the pen scratching softly against the cloth is so gentle that it becomes part of the silence rather than breaking it, like a footstep heard from inside a dream or the distant flapping of wings. And each mark, whether a line of trade calculations, a list of goods sold or promised, or simply notes on the weather, or the dreams he had the night before, carries with it the weight of memory, of repetition, of the belief that if things are written, they are not entirely lost. And while others sleep or murmur quietly by the fire, this man continues his quiet task, eyes occasionally blinking slowly as he leans back, not to rest, but to let the ink settle, to allow the words to find their place, not just on the cloth, but in his mind, and the cloth itself, rough-edged and tinted slightly yellow from the oils it has absorbed over months of use, is rolled up slowly at the end of each session, the ink allowed to dry overnight in the dry desert air, and later stowed among other scrolls and folded records in a wooden chest with a lid that creaks and closes with a puff of dust, and no one disturbs him while he writes, not because he has asked for silence, but because something in his stillness, in the rhythm of his movements, commands a quiet kind of respect, the same way one lowers their voice when near a sleeping child or a shrine. And on some nights, when the wind carries the smell of distant smoke, or the stars are particularly sharp above, he pauses in his writing to look outward, eyes adjusting slowly to the dark, and he might hum under his breath, or recite something remembered not to share, but to mark the space between words. And eventually, when the ink is low or his hand begins to ache, he sets the reed aside carefully, wipes it clean with a small cloth folded into quarters, and gently fans the still wet writing with a thin wooden strip, watching the black fade from shine to matte. And then, with the same care one gives to folding a letter from someone beloved, he lifts the cloth from the tray, folds it along the creases already worn into it by many previous nights, and places it gently in the chest, laying a small stone on top to keep it from shifting during travel. And when he finally leans back against the wall of the tent and closes his eyes, he does not fall asleep immediately, but remains still, breathing in the faint scent of ink and oil, letting the quiet that now surrounds him settle back into the air, as if the writing was not just an act of recording, but a way of balancing the stillness of the road itself. Coiled carefully near the back of the supply cart, where it rests beside an iron pan, a torn saddle strap, and a cluster of dented copper bowls, the rope appears, at first glance, to be nothing more than another tired tool, its once firm braiding now frayed in places, its ends wrapped in makeshift knots to stop further unraveling. And yet, despite its rough appearance and clear age, it remains in constant use, trusted for tasks both large and small, because the people of the caravan know that the rope, though visibly worn, holds with a loyalty that is rarely questioned. And each morning, when goods are strapped to camels or tents lashed tighter against the threat of midday winds, someone will reach for that rope, lifting it gently as if greeting an old friend, running a hand down its length to check for new wear, new weaknesses, and usually finding the same familiar spots. The thin place in the middle, where it once rubbed too long against a sharp-edged crate, the blackened section near the end, from where it sat too close to the fire on a wet night, the small knot tucked deep into its center that no one can remember tying, but no one wants to undo. And it has held tents steady during sandstorms, secured loads on slippery slopes, been knotted into harnesses for animals, and looped into pulleys to lower pots into wells, always almost unraveling, always just holding on. And when it's pulled taut, it doesn't groan or snap, but stiffens in silence, its fibers biting into one another with the quiet resolve of something long past its prime, yet still determined to matter. And even during the long stretches, when it isn't used, when it rests curled at the bottom of the cart or draped over a post to dry, it seems to hum with a kind of anticipation, as though it knows its moment will come again. And in the evenings, as the camp settles and the camels shift slowly into rest, someone may sit nearby and casually pick at the rope's frayed ends, not to fix them, but simply to pass the time, tugging at single strands, twisting and releasing, sometimes rewrapping a torn spot with thin twine, offering no permanent solution, but a gesture of care nonetheless. And over time, it has become something more than just a tool. It's a presence, a quiet partner in the journey, holding not only weight, but memory, carrying in its loosened twists, the dust of every place it's been dragged, the sweat of every hand that has gripped it, the tension of every moment, It held something together that would have otherwise fallen apart, and when it's finally replaced, as it inevitably must be, it won't be discarded outright, not burned or buried, but tucked somewhere soft, perhaps under a saddle or inside a cloth roll, as if it might be needed again, or perhaps just remembered, because even if its strength has faded, the story of its usefulness lingers. And in a world where the road is long and the nights are quiet and the smallest things carry the greatest weight, a rope that is always almost unraveling, yet never quite lets go, can be as reassuring as the fire that still glows, the stars that still turn, and the breath of a camel resting just out of sight beneath a low canvas awning stretched between two carts at the outermost edge of the camp. A man lies with his back against a folded saddle and his legs extended beneath a woolen cloak, his head tilted slightly as though listening to something just beyond the reach of silence, his eyes closed not tightly, but with a gentle heaviness that suggests rest rather than sleep. And yet, despite the stillness of his body, there is an alertness in the way his hands rest loosely beside a short, wooden staff, in the way his ears seem always tuned to the small changes in wind and weight and sound. And though those passing by might assume he is asleep, and indeed, he might appear so, having drifted into that quiet state where breath deepens and limbs soften, those who know him understand that this is his way, to listen while resting, to remain present even in dreams, to serve as a kind of breathing thread between the world of movement and the world of pause. And on this particular night, as stars sharpen into clarity above the camp and the fire burns low and steady, he lies unmoving while the desert speaks in its hushed language, the crunch of cooling sand beneath a shifting camel's foot, the distant bark of a night creature echoing from beyond the rocky ridge, the almost imperceptible rattle of something small, like a pebble tumbling free from a basket left tilted. And though none of these sounds disturb the others, all deeply asleep within their tents and blankets, the man's breath subtly shifts with each one, a silent acknowledgement, not alarmed, not disturbed, but aware, the same way a tree bends, without breaking when the wind passes through, and nearby, his companion, a young boy tasked with watching beside him for the first time, has long since fallen fully asleep, his head resting on a rolled cloak, mouth slightly open, fingers still curled around a sling he hasn't learned how to use well, and the man doesn't wake him, doesn't nudge him or whisper reminders of duty, for he remembers his own first night, the weight of fear and pride wrapped together in the silence, and he knows that real vigilance is something taught by the desert itself, over time, through repetition, through the way a breeze carries news long before feet do. And as the hours pass, the stars arc across the sky in their slow, ancient path, and the temperature dips with such gradualness that the cold is not felt all at once, but seeps in like a story being told from the end backward. And still the man lies there, eyes closed, yet hearing everything, the sigh of someone turning in sleep, the sputter of a dying ember, the sudden, solitary gust that lifts a corner of canvas and lets it fall again. And it is not that he fears danger, nor does he expect it tonight. It is simply that He knows the road, knows the stillness is not the absence of sound, but the accumulation of tiny, meaningful ones. And when the first light of dawn begins to stroke the edge of the eastern sky with that soft, silver hue that precedes color, he finally opens his eyes, not quickly, not with any sudden movement, but with the same slow awareness he's held all night, and without sitting up, without even speaking, he lifts his hand and gently taps the boy's shoulder, a signal not of urgency, but of rhythm, because this is what being awake means here, not the absence of sleep, but the fullness of attention, even when the eyes are closed, nestled just slightly off center on the edge of the fire pit, where the coals burn with a patient glow rather than a roar. The dented metal kettle rests in its usual spot, tilted ever so slightly to one side, the base uneven from years of use, and one shallow burn mark darkening the handle, where someone once forgot it in the flames a little too long, and though it no longer gleams and never truly did, it carries with it a quiet kind of importance, not because of its appearance or efficiency, but because of the role it plays night after night, morning after morning, pouring warmth into cups and bowls, never asked to do more than it was made for, yet always doing exactly that. And it is not the only kettle in the caravan, not the newest or the largest or the easiest to clean, but somehow it is the one they all reach for first, the one that fits perfectly between two flat stones that frame the hearth, the one whose spout dribbles just a little when the tea is too hot, as if giving warning before the steam rises too quickly. And there is a kind of rhythm to its life, a predictable cycle that comforts more than surprises, where each evening it is filled with water from a goatskin or clay jug, then placed upon the heat as the sky begins to dim and the conversations around the camp settle into softer tones, and the bubbling that begins deep within its rounded belly is not abrupt or noisy, but more like a sigh, a slow ascent of sound that blends into the night, the way a gentle breeze weaves through the edge of a tent. And when it's ready, someone always seems to know, without looking, lifting it with a cloth-wrapped hand, careful of the bent handle that can pinch if held too carelessly, and then pouring with the kind of steadiness that comes only from repetition. And no one thanks the kettle directly, no one praises its form or its function, but they notice when it's missing, even for a night. They notice when it's replaced with something cleaner but less familiar, and they ask where it's gone, even if only to know it will return tomorrow. And during the quiet hours, after the tea has been poured, and the stories have ended, and the silence deepens around the edges of the firelight, the kettle remains where it was left, still warm, still catching glints of flame against its dark, warped surface, like an ember that has chosen to hold its glow a little longer. And sometimes someone might tap it gently with a spoon, just to hear the dull, metallic note it offers, a kind of lullaby forged from utility and patience. And in the early morning, when the sky is still more gray than blue, and the chill creeps low into sleeping mats, the same kettle is the first thing to return to the fire, filled again, steam rising slow and ribbon-like as the day begins, not with noise, but with ritual. And though it wobbles just a little when set down, And though the lid must sometimes be coaxed into place with a soft nudge, no one minds, because the kettle is part of the camp now, part of the Silk Road itself in its way, traveling without walking, serving without needing attention, and always, somehow, finding its place near the flame, folded neatly on the edge of a low sleeping mat that rests atop a tightly woven rug of camel hair and plant-dyed fibers. The blanket lies in patient stillness, its weightless corners lifting slightly with the occasional breeze that sneaks under the tense, loose flap. And though its threads are uneven in places, and some of the stitching along the border has begun to loosen from years of movement and folding, it remains the favored covering of an elder merchant who always sleeps closest to the western edge of camp, not because it is thickest or newest, but because it carries with it the scent and softness of countless nights passed beneath open skies and canvas roofs, the faint but enduring aroma of sand and spice, of campfires and cedarwood smoke, of the slow exhale of pack animals resting nearby, and of sun-warmed fabric cooled by evening air. And when unfolded each night, it releases these memories without fanfare, quietly seeping into the stillness of the sleeping space, surrounding its owner not with warmth alone, but with familiarity, with the reassurance that no matter how many miles stretch behind or ahead, this moment, wrapped in these threads, will always be enough. And it's not just the smell, though, that lingers like a friendly whisper. It's also the way the blanket drapes without stiffness, shaped not by design, but by years of being tucked around tired bodies, of being pulled close against the chest when the wind grows sharp or when sleep is slow to come. And it has its quirks, this blanket, a patch sewn near one corner from a piece of an old headscarf, a thin stripe where the dye faded unevenly after being caught in a surprise rain, a small, hardened spot where wax once dripped and was never quite scraped clean. And yet each imperfection is part of its story, part of the comfort it offers, as if the very wear it carries is the thing that makes it most reliable. And those who pass by the elder's tent in early morning, before the fire has been rekindled, often see the blanket pulled high, covering to shoulder and head, with only a soft rise and fall beneath to show that someone is still breathing there, wrapped in the quiet solitude that only a trusted blanket can provide. And when the sun rises and voices begin to stir around the camp, the elder eventually folds it again, not with great precision, but with gentle familiarity, smoothing the edges and patting the center before placing it once more on the rug, as though the blanket, too, deserves a moment of rest before the next journey. And once, when it was accidentally left behind at a resting post 2 days away, the elder sent a messenger back not for valuables or trade goods, but for the blanket. And when it returned, dusty and crumpled, the look of calm that settled across the elder's face said more than any words of gratitude ever could. And now it travels carefully packed during the day, never buried under heavier items, always close at hand for sudden winds or quiet rests along the roadside. And though many on the road carry their own coverings, none seem quite so deeply lived in. None seem to hum with the memory of shared sleep and weathered nights like this one does. And so each evening, when it is laid out once more, and the elder settles beneath it with a sigh that belongs more to the soul than the body. The blanket does what it always has. It holds warmth, keeps stories, and smells like 100 camps waiting quietly in the folds, sitting on the worn edge of a wooden crate that serves as both table and bench when needed. The bowl waits, not for anything in particular, not because it has been freshly washed or filled with food, but simply because it always ends up here, where it can be reached easily, where it can catch the light of the fire in a way that reveals the fine network of lines spidering across its glazed surface, like a quiet map of everything it's endured. And this bowl, no wider than a man's hand, and just deep enough to hold a serving of rice or stew, has long since passed the point of practical perfection. It leaks sometimes, but only when filled too high, and if one pours slowly, respecting its fragile rim and uneven weight, it still serves with a dignity earned not from elegance, but from stubborn survival. And there are at least 5 visible repairs where the ceramic cracked clean through and was sealed again, not with gold or lacquer, as in elegant traditions far east, but with the more humble paste of desert clay and melted resin, carefully applied and pressed by a quiet hand on a slow afternoon when there was time and a need to preserve what was already familiar. And each mend tells its own small story. The thin hairline fracture near the base that formed during a mountain crossing when everything froze at night and the fire couldn't be lit. The jagged break along one side from when a camel shifted too quickly and sent the whole supply crate tumbling. The rim that chipped during a storm when the tent collapsed inward and everything inside crashed together in a tangle of canvas, pots, and startled hands. And yet, despite all this, the bowl is still chosen, still pulled from its spot each evening when someone wants just a little more of what's been cooked, when someone needs to cool broth for a child or divide portions for a quiet meal alone, and it is held carefully, not pitied, not coddled, but treated with the understanding that some things, even when cracked and stitched back together, still hold value simply because they are known. And it's the kind of object that doesn't belong to anyone anymore. Not truly, though several people claim to have fixed it at one time or another, and each one insists they did it best. But no one guards it, and no one keeps it hidden, because the bowl has become part of the shared life of the caravan, passed from hand to hand, like a story that always returns slightly different, but never lost. And on nights when meals are especially sparse, and food is portioned out in smaller scoops, the bowl still circles quietly among those who remember its weight, who know how to tip it just right to avoid the weak seam near the bottom, who understand that some vessels, though imperfect, are more valuable for having been used than for being flawless. And when the meal ends, the bowl is rinsed with a handful of sand or a splash of boiled water, depending on what's available, then set to dry upside down on the edge of the crate once more, its shadow cast softly on the wood below, not bold or proud, but steady. And in that shadow lives a kind of lesson, one not spoken aloud, but understood in the way the bowl is treated, that mended things are not broken, that scars are not weaknesses, but memory made visible, and that usefulness, like love, is often quietest where it endures the longest. As the fire begins to dim and the stars thicken, in the high, dark sky above the caravan, the large wooden wheel of the supply wagon, the one with the iron-rimmed edge and the small notch missing from one of its spokes, casts a long, uneven shadow across the sand, its dark silhouette stretching slowly away from the fire, like the finger of time, reaching backward through the quiet layers of night. And though the wheel itself is unmoving, nestled deep into the desert earth, where it's been wedged for hours, its shadow seems to breathe with the flicker of every flame, expanding and narrowing as if it too is resting, caught in the soft pulse of the evening's rhythm. And no one really notices this shadow, not in a conscious way, for it does not dance or jump like the shadows of people moving past the fire, nor does it drift quickly like the small shadows of leaves or ropes swinging in the breeze, but rather it lies low, a dark stretch pressed into the cool dust, curving slightly with the uneven surface of the earth, wrapping gently around a pile of bundled cloth or a forgotten sandal, always soft at the edges, always just barely there. And yet, if someone were to sit near the fire long enough, if they stared toward the edge of the circle where the carts line up like quiet sentries, they might notice the shadow of the wheel and begin to follow its slow arc, seeing how it leans one way in the early night and another as the embers shrink and the moon climbs higher. And in that watching, they might begin to feel the longness of the road, the way each hour here doesn't just pass but stretches, slides, slips into the next, like water through fingers, unhurried and undisturbed. And the wheel itself, with its grooved rim and darkened wood, holds more than weight. It holds miles. It holds seasons. It has rolled across shale and sand, through dry riverbeds and narrow passes, through streets paved with stone, and across plains so flat that even wind would lose direction. And yet now it rests, the iron warm from the day, the wood cooled by the night, the hub packed with dust that no cloth can quite reach. And in resting, it lets the firelight sketch its story quietly into the ground, not with words or carvings, but with shape and shadow. And it is not a story of battles or heroes or discovery, but of persistence, of turning slowly under loads that needed moving, of groaning under weight without breaking, of being trusted enough to carry what mattered, even if no one remembered to praise it. And the shadow, stretched long and quiet, does not boast or weep. It simply echoes the form that cast it, bending to the earth's shape, disappearing slowly as the fire dies, just as it will appear again tomorrow when a new light comes from a different angle. And perhaps this is what peace is in this place, where rest is rare and movement is constant, the quiet trust that some things, even in darkness, continue to shape the world around them without needing to be seen, and the soft understanding that even the shadow of a wagon wheel can carry a kind of meaning if one is willing to sit long enough and slow enough to notice it. Half buried in the sandy soil where the edge of the camp blurs into open land, there lies a flat, gray stone no larger than a spread hand, its top surface worn smooth by time and touch, its lower half sunk into the ground so deeply that no one remembers ever having seen its full shape. And though it has no inscription, no mark to claim it or purpose to define it, it has quietly become a boundary, not official or declared, but understood by everyone who walks the edge of the sleeping, tents at dusk, setting down ropes or checking for loose canvas or pacing slowly out from the last firelit circle to stretch their legs before bed. And somehow, without being chosen, the stone is used again and again to mark where the camp ends and the night begins, where the comfort of human proximity fades into the hush of the open plain, and it is always there, a silent sentinel, slightly cool to the touch, even after the sun has gone down, its edge tilted just enough to catch the moonlight when the sky is clear, casting a small shadow like a whispered reminder that space has shape, and sometimes a traveler returning late from relieving themselves or checking on the camels will pause briefly when they see the stone, not for any practical reason, but as a kind of unspoken ritual, a moment to acknowledge the threshold between the warmth of the group and the vastness beyond. And over time, the stone has gathered a quiet dignity, never adorned, never moved, but occasionally brushed free of dust by a hand without thinking, or circled gently with the toe of a boot as someone stands nearby in thought. And in the morning, when the camp stirs and the horizon blushes with early light, it is often one of the first objects to be noticed by those emerging from tents, its small shadow already softening, its surface already warming beneath the rising sun. And though no one speaks of it, many use it as a turning point, a marker for short walks or slow pacing, a way to orient themselves before the wagons are loaded and the camp is broken down once again. And as the day begins and the carts creak into motion and footprints begin to scatter across the sand, the stone remains unmoved, unbothered, blending once more into the earth until evening returns and tents are pitched anew, and someone, without instruction or plan, places the last sleeping mat just before the spot where the stone rests, and on it go the patterns of days and nights, a rhythm that knows no calendar, only habit and quiet grace. And the stone keeps its place, a boundary that no one guards but everyone respects, not because it commands authority, but because it has been accepted by time, and in a place where roads are made of wind and memory, and boundaries are drawn more by silence than stake, the small stone at the edge of camp becomes something more than a rock. It becomes a pause, a hush, a quiet agreement between those who wander and the land that carries them, in a shallow depression just beyond the nearest line of tents, where the ground dips slightly as if cradling the soft weight of the desert's breath. There is a patch of sand finer than the rest, smoother, quieter, almost silk-like to the touch. And it is here that each evening one of the caravan's younger travelers finds a moment of solitude, crouching low with knees bent and hands cupped to scoop up a small handful of the desert, letting the grains slowly escape between their fingers as if measuring time not by clocks or stars, but by the pace of release, the soft falling of earth back to itself. And there is something deeply calming in the way the sand slips, not all at once, but in small ribbons and streams, catching the last light of the fire, then scattering into shadow, whispering against the skin like a secret that has no urgency. And every handful is different, every slow pour a slightly new pattern as the tiny particles shift and tumble, reshaping with each moment, but always returning to rest, to quiet, to the simple truth of being. And though it serves no task, no duty, this nightly ritual becomes its own form of stillness, a practice not taught but instinctive, as if the hands themselves remember how to listen through motion. And around them, the camp settles into deeper silence. Soft snores begin in the nearer tents. A bowl is set down gently on a crate. A rope creaks as it sways once before going still. But the hands continue, scooping and letting go, tracing invisible arcs in the air as the sand catches moonlight, turning it into something softer, rounder, less sharp than it seemed against the rocks. And when the wind lifts slightly, as it often does near midnight, it does not scatter the pile, but carries a few grains up into the air like sparks, letting them hang briefly before they spiral back to the ground, as though even the breeze knows not to interrupt too much. And sometimes a second set of hands joins in, a sibling or friend kneeling beside the first, not to speak or joke, but simply to sit, to mirror the motion, to join in the act of touching time. And for a while, there is nothing else. No tasks, no plans, no roles, just the feel of the earth slipping through warm skin, the rhythm of a world that moves even when no one is walking. And eventually, the first pair of hands slows. The sand rests undisturbed once more, and the child, or sometimes the grown traveler who needs the comfort of that moment, brushes off their palms, rising quietly, returning to their blanket or tent without a word. And the sand remains, accepting the return of stillness without resistance, waiting patiently for the next night, the next hand, the next small gesture of peace. And in that soft hollow outside the camp, where no fire reaches and no animal treads, the sand, fine and ancient, continues to be what it always has been, not just part of the land, but a keeper of silence, a teacher of slowness, a way to remember that even in the vastness of the Silk Road, there is room for stillness, one grain at a time, near the far end of the caravan line, away from the cooking fires, and just beyond where the last tent peg is hammered into the earth, there rests a particular camel, not the largest, nor the youngest, and certainly not the fastest, but one that has earned quiet affection among the travelers for one single trait that has never changed in all the weeks and months it has walked the road. The way it sits down at the end of each day, following the same deliberate pattern, step by step, as if it's a small ritual that must be performed exactly right before the night can truly begin. And those who notice it, especially the ones assigned to untether or unpack it, have learned to wait with quiet patience as the camel first shifts its front feet slightly forward, then exhales through its long nose in one slow gust that carries dust and memory alike, and then, and only then, lowers its front legs to the ground with a kind of resigned grace, pausing as if testing the temperature of the earth before allowing its heavy rear to sink slowly into the sand. And the whole motion, from the first stir of muscles to the final settling of weight into the ground, takes nearly a full minute, which is longer than most of the others need. but none of the handlers ever rush it because there is something soothing in watching this ritual unfold, something reliable in a world that shifts constantly. And once seated, the camel folds its legs just so, its knees tucked in with deliberate awkwardness that somehow resolves into balance, and then it stretches its long neck outward and lets its head droop slightly forward, as if surrendering not only to gravity, but to the comfort of stopping. And even the creak of its joints has become familiar, a sound more like an old door closing than any living thing, and yet part of the rhythm of the evening nonetheless. And around it, other camels settle too, some clumsier, some faster, some distracted by feed bags or the scent of a passing animal. But this one, always, this one, chooses the same open patch of ground, always a little higher than the others, as if it prefers the faintest view of the camp from above, even if it never looks. And when the stars begin to bloom overhead and the night wraps the camp in its cooling arms, the camel stays perfectly still, not asleep, not fully alert, but at peace in a way that needs no words. And nearby, travelers often set their bedding close to it, not because it is particularly warm or protective, but because its steadiness offers a kind of comfort, like sleeping near a wall that has never fallen. And in the early morning, when the sky has not yet decided between night and dawn, the camel will rise again in the same slow motion, reversing its process with the same determined pauses, as if the ground must be released gently, not pushed away. And though it never brays or complains, and though its gait is often slow during the day, there is something in its way of settling each night that reminds everyone who sees it that stillness too can be a kind of strength, and that the road is not only about moving forward, but also about knowing how and where to rest. Hanging from a bent iron hook at the center post of the main tent, the old brass lantern swings just slightly in the dry desert breeze, its small flame barely taller than a thumb, yet holding steady against the hush of night, casting soft amber light in uneven circles on the faded canvas walls, and scattering shadows that move gently, like thoughts not yet spoken. And though it is not the brightest or newest among the few lanterns carried by the caravan, it is always the last one extinguished, and the first one lit, a silent keeper of time and routine, whose quiet glow has marked the transition from dusk to sleep for longer than most can recall. And the glass is smudged with soot in the corners, despite careful wiping, and the frame bears tiny dents from years of use and a dozen accidental drops. But the wick remains strong, the flame quick to catch when the match touches its curled edge, and there's a kind of reverence in the way the hands of the older travelers handle it, not because it is beautiful or rare, but because it has never failed, not through wind, not through storms, not even on that one long night when the entire camp huddled in silence while jackals cried from the dark hills nearby. And even then, while voices stayed low and hands trembled slightly on blades not meant to be drawn, the lantern remained lit, not flaring up, not dimming, simply being, and its light is not powerful enough to read by unless held close, and certainly not strong enough to guide a path through the dunes. But it is enough to see the shape of a face, to recognize a friend from a stranger, to boil water without guessing, and for many, that is more than enough. And as night deepens, and most fires fall to coals, and the sounds of the camp fade to the occasional cough or shifting blanket, the lantern stays, hanging quietly above the woven sleeping mats and the low tables where empty bowls still sit, casting light on nothing in particular, illuminating only what it happens to touch: the curve of a rolled rug, the gleam of a spoon, the edge of a map folded long ago, and occasionally the breeze makes the flame dance a little faster, throwing brief sparks of gold into the darker corners, but never so wild that it draws alarm, only just enough to remind anyone still awake that the night, too, has a pulse, and often the last person to sleep will pause beneath it, glancing up for a moment before pulling their blanket tight or stepping outside to check the tethered animals one last time. And though they rarely speak, the glance is always the same, a quiet acknowledgement, as if thanking the flame for being there, for continuing to glow when everything else has gone still. And in the early morning, before the camp begins to stir, the lantern is finally extinguished by a gentle hand, the flame pinched out with practiced fingers or a soft puff of breath, and the smell of it, warm, faintly metallic, touched with oil, lingers for just a moment longer in the air, as though the light itself were bowing out gracefully. And then the lantern is lifted from the hook, wiped down with the corner of a cloth, and packed carefully into its small wooden case, ready to hang once more when the next night returns, its flicker waiting quietly inside, always ready to begin again, folded neatly between two layers of wool, inside the bottom of a worn leather satchel. The old map lies mostly forgotten, its once crisp creases now softened by heat and handling, its ink faded to shades of gray and sepia that blend gently into the fibrous parchment like the lines of an aged hand. And though no one truly uses it anymore to find direction, no one has ever dared to throw it away either, as if doing so would sever a quiet connection to something older than any single journey, something woven into the very idea of travel itself. And when unrolled, which happens rarely and always with great care, it releases a subtle, musty scent of pressed dust and dried air, a smell that seems to carry the memory of long roads, uncertain crossings, and stories whispered by firelight. And the map is not especially accurate by modern measure, for mountains are drawn too sharply. Rivers meander in places they never touched, and some settlements marked with careful calligraphy no longer exist or never did. Yet still the map holds a gravity of its own, a dignity born not from precision, but from presence, from having been there, carried across dunes and high passes, laid out beneath the stars, and traced with fingers sticky with dried figs or cracked from cold, and the edges have frayed, especially the bottom left corner, where countless thumbs have pressed it flat, and the center fold threatens to tear with every opening, yet the names still show through, curled letters naming far-off lands and forgotten wells, winding paths marked with dots too tiny to track, and notations scribbled in margins that no one now can translate, but which are always read with the same pause, the same wonder, and it is sometimes taken out not for guidance, but for comfort during long halts when the wind refuses to sleep or the fire won't catch. When a traveler needs to see a line drawn across space, to remember that movement has meaning, and the one who usually carries it, a man too young to have drawn it, and too old to forget its worth, unfolds it on his lap and smooths it with the side of his hand, saying nothing, letting the younger ones lean close to look, not correcting them, not explaining, just sharing the silence of it, the gravity of old marks made with old intent, and someone will always point to a place, ask if they've been there, and someone else will answer with a half story, a maybe memory, a shrug, because the truth of the map isn't in the accuracy, but in its witness. It has been on the journey, has weathered every crossing, has heard every tale, and when the moment passes and the fire begins to dim, the map is folded again, not along the original lines anymore, but along new ones, gentler ones shaped by time and trust, and it is tucked once more into its quiet space where it rests, unseen but remembers. And even though there are newer maps now, etched on waxed cloth or carried as markings in the mind, this old one remains, a kind of sacred object, not for navigation, but for grounding, a reminder that every path once had a beginning, every crossing once needed belief, and that even now, under this darkened sky and this flickering flame, we are still following lines drawn long before us, even if only in spirit, leaning quietly against the inside wall of the supply cart nearest the cooking area, nestled beside a stack of worn baskets and a coil of extra rope. The grain sack slouches in a way that suggests weariness, its thick linen sides wrinkled and soft from handling, its edges stained with oil and dust, and its once bright stitching now muted into the pale beige of things that have been useful for a long, long time. And yet, despite its unimpressive appearance, despite the way it sinks lower each week and seems thinner every evening, it continues to offer just enough to thicken the stew, to press into a flat cake over the fire, to add a small handful to boiling water when the food supply feels dangerously low, and no one quite remembers when the sack was first filled or who tied the loop at the top, but it's been there as long as anyone can recall, passed from caravan to caravan, packed and unpacked without question, its drawstring loosened and tightened. So many times the fibers are polished smooth like river stones, and the grain inside is nothing special, just a mix of barley and millet with the occasional cracked lentil, the kind that doesn't spoil quickly and doesn't complain when cooked without spice. But there's something almost magical in the way the sack never seems to run out. Not really, not entirely. And though they've scooped from it every day through sandstorms and snow, through hunger and celebration, there always seems to be another handful left, another small reserve nestled into a fold near the bottom, as if the sack is quietly, modestly determined not to fail the people who rely on it. And there are stories whispered by the older travelers, late at night when the fire has died low, stories that say the sack was once gifted by a passing monk, or blessed at a forgotten shrine, or stitched from cloth woven in a market where time moves slower than elsewhere. But no one believes these tales fully, and yet no one denies them either. because what matters is not how it began, but what it continues to be, a quiet, dependable promise in the shape of a bag. And when the cook kneels beside it in the morning, brushing sand from its sides and dipping in with a flat wooden scoop, there's always a pause, a moment of expectation, and the soft sound of grain settling inside is somehow as reassuring as any spoken word, a signal that today's meal, however simple, will happen. And on long days, when the wagon's groan and the wind brings more silence than comfort, just the sight of that bag slouched against the cart wall is enough to steady a person's thoughts. And though they've considered replacing it, perhaps dividing its contents into smaller sacks for better weight distribution, no one ever does, because to touch it too much, to disturb its shape or change its place, would be to interfere with whatever quiet agreement it holds with the journey. And so it remains, patched in places where rodents once nibbled, sewn up in threads that don't match, smelling faintly of flour and old campfires, the kind of object that doesn't demand gratitude, but earns it. And when night falls, and meals are done, and the sack is retied and nudged gently back into the shadows of the cart, it becomes once again what it always is, not just a container, but a companion, a steady, silent thread in the fabric of the Silk Road's quiet hours, each night, long after most voices have fallen into whispers or faded entirely beneath thick blankets and dreams. And after the last ember has curled into ash and the soft creak of tent fabric has stilled, the watchkeeper rises, not from a call or alarm, but from a habit, from a rhythm built slowly over years of crossing and resting, of listening more than speaking. And he doesn't wear anything special, just the same wool cloak he used as a pillow earlier, and a small pouch at his belt, carrying nothing more than a flint, a string of dried berries, and a smooth river stone that fits perfectly in his hand, worn not for defense or trade, but for the quiet assurance it offers in the stillness of night. And with each step, his boots press into the sand without sound, leaving only the faintest impression that is often gone by morning, erased by wind or by the weight of waking footsteps. And he walks slowly, not in haste, not even in purposeful vigilance, but in a wide circle around the sleeping camp, passing the corners of tents and the rear wheels of supply wagons, the tethered camels who blink lazily at his movement, too accustomed to his passing to lift their heads, and his eyes scan not for danger, but for absence, for anything that should be there but isn't, a tent flap left open, a fire pit still glowing too hot, a water skin rolled too far from its place. And though he rarely finds anything amiss, the watching matters, the knowing that someone walks while others sleep. And sometimes, not often, he will pause near the shadow of a collapsed stool, or beside the latrine trench, or at the far end of the rope line, and simply breathe, not deeply, not dramatically, but slowly, measuring time not in minutes or steps, but in the movement of air in and out of his chest. And on especially quiet nights, he hums, not a song, not really, just a note, low and soft and even, like the murmur of wind along canvas. And the note does not travel far, but it fills the air around him like smoke, comforting, intangible, and gone as soon as it came. And by the time he returns to his small blanket near the edge of the leader's tent, the stars have shifted slightly in the sky, and a thin layer of coolness has settled into the ground, and he does not write anything down, does not report, because there is nothing to say, and nothing that hasn't been the same night after night. And yet if asked in the morning whether anything happened, he would say, all was well, and he would mean it, because in the act of walking, of noticing, of being awake when no one else is, he has ensured that the boundary between sleep and danger has remained undisturbed, and so, without fanfare or acknowledgement, he curls once more beneath his cloak, the river stone still warm in his palm, and closes his eyes, knowing that soon enough someone else will rise, perhaps a younger one or one who can't sleep, and perhaps they will not walk the whole camp, but they will rise, and the rhythm will continue, not broken, only passed, like a flame that never flares, but also never dies, and the Silk Road sleeps on, tucked into the bottom of a wooden chest, beneath folded fabric scraps, broken combs, and the dried remains of pressed herbs whose scent has long since faded. The ink-stained ledger lies closed, its rough cover cracked from years of being handled by sun-dried hands, its corners curled and softened like the pages of a well-traveled book. And though no one has opened it in many weeks, it remains there, not as an object of utility, but as something quietly respected, a relic of purpose from earlier days. In the caravan, when every transaction, every lent sack of grain or traded bar of soap, every tally of salted meat or shared wool blanket was written by careful fingers into its lined pages, and the writing inside, if one were to lift the heavy lid and peel open the cover, would be tight and slanted, dark in some places and faded in others, as if time itself has tried to smooth the record into silence, and here and there the ink has bled through or smudged, under the press of a thumb or the moisture of a hurried night. But each entry still tells a tiny story, a line noting 3 water jugs taken by a man, whose name is now forgotten, but whose debt was repaid in dried fruit, a margin scribble, reminding the scribe to check on the broken saddle strap, a looping symbol that once meant delivered, but now looks more like a bird mid-flight. And though no one in the current caravan has ridden in it recently, none have dared to discard it, for it has come to represent more than record-keeping. It holds the weight of continuity, the sense that someone, at some point, cared enough to trace every exchange, to acknowledge every small act of fairness, and in doing so, left behind a slow rhythm of honesty that still lingers. And sometimes, when the night is especially long, and the fires burn low, and the desert wind whispers like turning pages, one of the elders will retrieve the ledger, brushing off the lint and dust, before sitting cross-legged beside it, opening to a random spot and reading not aloud, but with their eyes, letting the names and numbers pass over their thoughts like the wind through date palms, stirring memories of those who came before and the quiet trades that kept them going. And no one interrupts when this happens. Nearby, those awake will look up briefly, then return to their tasks, knowing the ledger offers no surprise and no danger, only remembrance. And when it is finally closed, the elder may nod once to themselves, satisfied that the past still breathes softly between the lines, and the book is returned, not with ceremony, but with the careful respect given to something that once mattered greatly and still matters in ways difficult to explain. And even though no one records each item these days, and food is shared more by trust than tally, the ledger remains, a quiet witness to the idea that balance, when practiced long enough, becomes part of a place. And under the layers of linen and string, beneath the low hum of sleep and the rustle of canvas, it waits, as pages do, not to be opened, but simply to be known. Atop a low wooden crate just beside the fire pit, the one surrounded by worn stones and ashes from 100 slow meals, there rests a small ceramic teacup, no larger than a child's palm, and painted with a single faded band of blue near the rim, its surface chipped in 2 places, and its base darkened from years of being set down too close to glowing coals. And though the caravan carries other cups, newer ones, sturdier ones, made of tin or wood, this one is different, not because it is beautiful or rare, but because it is only ever used at one particular time, just after the sun has dipped beyond the dunes, when the sky shifts from amber to violet and the air begins its gentle cooling. And no matter how rushed the day has been or how long the trail, someone, often the same someone, though it's never formally assigned, will reach for this little cup and fill it with a thin, fragrant tea brewed over the day's final fire, often no more than a few drops of desert herbs steeped in boiled water, enough to warm the hands, but not strong enough to keep anyone awake. And the cup is lifted slowly, held carefully with both hands, as if the warmth might slip away too fast. And the first sip is never taken until the final sliver of sun has vanished from sight, as though the tea somehow seals the day closed, letting its steam carry away the dust and weariness before night properly begins. And no one speaks much during this moment, not because of any rule, but because the hush that falls over the camp at sunset is too delicate to disturb. A hush made of sighs, of shifting light, of the low sound of camels exhaling, and tense tightening in the breeze. And the person holding the cup, whether it's an elder with tired bones or a young rider returning from a long scouting path, never gulps it down, but sips it slowly, letting the cup warm their fingers, letting their breath rise with the steam like a second kind of incense. And by the time the tea is finished, the fire has usually dimmed to coals, and the first stars begin to reveal themselves overhead, and the cup is set gently back onto the crate, empty now, but still warm, still fragrant, still quietly alive in the air. And though others may use different mugs for their evening drink, no one touches the teacup after sunset, not until the next day, not until the next sliver of sun. And this rhythm has held for so long that it has become part of the camp's fabric, as expected as the morning call to stir, or the evening rope that ties down the tents. And the cup itself bears the signs of its ritual, tiny stains in the cracks of the glaze, a slight tilt to one side that makes it look as though it's always listening. And in its smallness lies something sacred, not in a grand or spiritual sense, but in the way that simple repetition can make an object glow with meaning. And long after the drinker has returned to their bedding and the camp has gone to sleep, The cup remains where it was placed, cooling beside the coals, its last breath of steam curling into the dark, a final, silent act of closure for the day. There, just off the narrow track, carved by countless wagon wheels and the padded hooves of camels, sits a single, rounded pebble, no larger than a walnut, and light gray in color, with a speck of rust-colored mineral running like a sleepy vein across its curved surface. And while there are thousands of other stones scattered across the vast plain, this one has earned a quiet recognition, not because of its shape or hue, but because it always seems to lie in the same spot, precisely where the path bends slightly around a low mound of wind-blown sand, exactly halfway between the front and rear ends of the caravan, nestled into a dip where the wheel tracks split momentarily before converging again, a small pause in the otherwise linear rhythm of the journey. And no one placed it there on purpose, at least not recently, and no one moves it even when carts jostle past or sandals kick up small clouds of dust nearby, for it has become, in its stillness, a kind of companion, a midpoint to be noticed only in the soft way the eyes fall on something familiar without surprise, and some of the walkers, especially those who travel with heavier loads or slower strides, mark their progress by it, telling themselves they are halfway to the next rest, or that they've done enough now to deserve a sip of water. And while no one speaks these thoughts aloud, there is a shared quiet around the pebble whenever someone passes it, a slight slowing of steps, a hand adjusting the strap on a pack, a glance downward, not out of curiosity, but recognition. And during pauses in movement, when the sun is too high or the wind too strong, the pebble might find itself surrounded by the tips of walking sticks or flanked by the shadows of resting bodies, and it never seems to sink, no matter how many feet or hooves pass, nor does it disappear beneath dust or sand, as if the very wind respects its position. And once, years ago perhaps, someone tried to remove it, thinking it a tripping hazard, or perhaps looking for a smoother rock to use for sharpening a blade. But they returned it moments later, unsatisfied, and set it gently back in its place without explanation. And now it simply is, a marker without a name, a reference point without measurement, a thing that keeps no time but is known by all who follow this section of road. And in the silence of night, when the stars stretch wide and the path is empty, the pebble rests like it always does, catching starlight on its polished surface, reflecting the pale gleam of the moon in a way that flickers ever so slightly when a breeze disturbs the sand around it. And even then, it stays unmoved, not buried, not brushed aside, as if it belongs to the path more than any sign or flag could. And in the morning, when the first cart rattles past and the day begins again, someone will glance at it without slowing, without speaking, and the journey will continue. But the pebble will remain, a quiet midpoint, a silent signal that the road, like the sleep that soon follows, has shape even when no one draws the map. On the outer hem of the merchant's left sleeve, barely noticeable unless you are sitting quite close, there hangs a thin, fraying thread no longer than a fingernail, pale against the deep maroon of his woven tunic. And although it would take only the lightest tug to remove it, or a single flick of a blade to sever it cleanly, the thread has remained untouched for longer than anyone can quite remember. and there's no record of when it first appeared, whether it was pulled loose during the loading of sacks in Samarkand, or caught on a brass clasp during a hurried greeting in Bukhara, or perhaps worked itself free one night as he reached to pull his cloak tighter during a restless sleep beside the fire. But it remains, softly swaying with each of his movements, rising and falling slightly with the rhythm of his step, and curling inward when he rests his hands together during the evening's quiet. And over time, the thread has become something of a quiet companion, not just to the merchant, but to those who notice it. The young assistant who always walks on his left side, sometimes staring at the thread instead of the road. The weaver who offered once, just once, to restitch the hem, but was gently refused. And even the cook, who sometimes claims, in a voice only half joking, that the merchant's fortune is tied up in that bit of dangling cloth, and the thread itself has faded, just slightly, from sunlight and sand, but its form holds, a delicate spiral at the tip, as though it's been wound around invisible memory. And when the wind rises, it dances a little, not erratically, not like a banner or scarf, but in small, thoughtful arcs, as if it knows not to draw attention, only to remind. And there is a comfort in its presence, not because it's meaningful in any grand way, but because it represents something small that has persisted, something left alone in a world where so much is mended, replaced, or forgotten. And sometimes, during the long stillness after dinner, when the stars are just beginning to shape themselves overhead, and the fire casts warm shadows on the circle of resting bodies, the merchant will lift his sleeve slightly and look at the thread, not with worry or annoyance, but with a kind of fond recognition, as if nodding to an old story that doesn't need repeating, and others have begun to associate it with luck or steadiness, or even the weather, quietly noting how it hangs when the air is thick, or lifts when the night is dry, building small myths around it, not out of belief, but out of affection. And perhaps, in a way, the thread has come to embody what it means to be on the road, a part of something larger, swaying between movement and stillness, fraying gently, but never breaking, catching the wind, but always remaining. And when the merchant sleeps, his arms folded beneath his head or tucked into his robe, the thread rests too, flattened softly against the sleeve, but still there. And in the morning, when he rises with the others and shakes out the folds of his tunic, it flicks back to life, fluttering once before falling into place, and with it begins another day, another mile, another quiet turn of the road beneath the stars, lying in the center of a shared wooden tray used by the camp cooks and passed around during evening meals. There is a spoon made of dark, smooth wood with a slightly flattened bowl and a handle worn to a soft curve by time and many hands. And while nearly every other utensil in the camp has a known owner or a predictable place, this spoon is different, not because it's forgotten, but because it somehow belongs to everyone and no one at the same time. And the strange thing is that no one remembers who carved it, or where it came from, or when it began its quiet rotation through the hands of the caravan, and yet it appears with reliable frequency, tucked beneath a bowl of porridge one morning, then used to stir tea in a clay pot the next, then found beside a pile of dates on a copper plate as if it had always been there. And though it has been chipped at the rim and darkened by countless stews, no one replaces it and no one avoids it. In fact, there is something reassuring about the feel of its surface, slightly sticky with oil, no matter how many times it's rinsed in the shallow wash basins or wiped clean with a cloth. And when someone uses it, there is no comment, no hesitation, just a quiet continuation of its endless cycle, a simple gesture of acceptance, as if passing around an old story that doesn't need retelling. And sometimes, at the end of a long day, when the wind has been sharp and everyone's shoulders ache from too much lifting or too many miles, the spoon finds its way into the lap of someone who didn't expect it, perhaps a new traveler, or a quiet child, or an elder who hasn't spoken much lately. And when it does, there's often a brief pause, a glance downward, a soft smile, or a moment of stillness, as if the spoon itself carries something more than function, perhaps a calmness passed down from every person who has held it before. And when meals are over, and bowls scraped clean, and fire embers sink into ash, the spoon is not carefully packed away, but gently laid down on a nearby cloth, or left resting against the edge of a pot, or slipped absent-mindedly into a basket where someone else will find it. And so it continues, from hand to hand, meal to meal, a small object that leaves no record but is never lost, a part of the evening that does not announce itself but is quietly remembered, and in a place where everything must be accounted for, from grain rations to leather straps. The spoon stands outside that order, not in defiance, but in quiet freedom. And some say it brings good sleep if you're the one to use it last, though no one really believes that. And yet when the night deepens and sleep begins to pull gently at the corners of thought, and the camp lies hushed beneath a blanket of stars, the spoon remains where it was placed, untouched but not forgotten, still carrying the warmth of its last touch, the quiet legacy of all the meals it has helped complete, folded neatly at the foot of a low cot made from canvas and rope, near the edge of the tent closest to the morning sun, lies a thick woolen blanket, striped with faded tones of brown, sand, and smoke gray, its fibers coarse yet comforting, scratchy at first touch, but always warm by the second, and woven so long ago that no one remembers where the loom stood or who spun the thread. And though there are many blankets among the caravan, this one is quietly set apart by a single irregularity, a single stitch, near one edge, done in bright red thread, where all the others are dull and neutral, a lone strand that loops defiantly against the pattern as if it belonged to a different design altogether. And it's a small thing, barely the width of a fingernail, but once seen, it's never forgotten, and anyone who sleeps under the blanket comes to know it well. Some even claim they dream more deeply when the red stitch rests over their heart, while others prefer it by the feet, believing it holds in warmth, and no one has ever attempted to replace or remove the stitch, even though it stands out boldly against the earth-toned rose, because the flaw has become part of the blanket's identity, as familiar and reassuring as the softness of its corners, or the way it smells faintly of wood smoke and the sun-dried wool. And sometimes, during cold desert nights, when the wind sighs against the tent walls, and even the embers of the fire grow shy and dim, the person curled beneath this blanket will find their fingers drifting toward the red thread without meaning to, rubbing it gently between thumb and forefinger, not to fidget or fix, but simply to touch something steady, something imperfect, in just the right way. And there are stories, whispered from sleeper to sleeper, about how the red thread came to be. Some say it was stitched in by a mother's hand as a blessing. Others claim it marks the thread that bound two lost travelers back together when they met again on the road. But most simply accept it as one of those small mysteries that belong to the caravan, the way wind sometimes hums like a flute in the tent ropes, or the way some camels seem to always choose the same resting spot. And when the blanket is laid out at night, shaken once to release the dust, and stretched over tired limbs, the red stitch catches the last flicker of firelight, glinting briefly before disappearing into the folds. And though it offers no more warmth than any other stitch, it brings with it a kind of stillness, a visual heartbeat that reminds the sleeper they are wrapped in something known. And by morning, when the sun peers gently into the fabric and the calls to stir echo through the camp, the blanket is folded. Again, the red stitch tucked quietly into the layers where it will wait, not hidden, but resting, ready for the next evening, the next story, the next quiet night, where it will once again press softly into someone's dreams. There is a wagon near the center of the caravan, not the oldest, nor the largest, but one with a wheel that creaks, not loudly or with protest, but with a steady, familiar groan that rises and falls with each full turn, a slow sound of worn wood against iron that seems to speak in a language only the road understands. And the creak has been there so long that it's no longer considered a flaw, but a companion, a kind of voice that belongs to the journey itself. And when the caravan moves after sunrise, weaving quietly between low hills and dune shadows, that wheel creaks with the rhythm of progress, keeping slow, even time-like, a drum played for no audience. And though some have offered to fix it, applying oil or tightening spokes, the sound always returns, softened for a time perhaps, but never gone, as if the wheel resists silence, the way a fire resists complete stillness. And when people walk beside the wagon, they adjust their steps to match the creak. And when animals rest near it, they seem to settle into its tempo. And even those who do not speak much, or are new to the road, begin to find a strange comfort in that sound, as if it signals not burden but endurance. And during the night, when the wagons are still, and the camp has folded into sleep, that creak is absent, yet imagined. Travelers sometimes dream of it, mistaking its remembered sound for wind or distant footsteps, and when they wake, they often listen for it without realizing they are doing so. And there are moments in the late evening, just before bedding down, when someone might lean against that wagon's frame and give it a gentle push, just enough to rock the wheel and coax out a single creak, not out of need, but as if checking that the heartbeat of the day still hums. And the creak is not sharp, not metallic, but mellow, like old leather stretched, or a tree trunk settling deeper into the earth. And sometimes, when the camp is quiet and a story is being told in low tones near the fire, the wheel creaks softly in the background, offering a kind of punctuation to the silence, like a nod at the end of each sentence, and no one remarks on it anymore. The same way, no one remarks on the stars returning each night, or the fact that every morning someone will always light the first flame, and when the caravan must cross rough ground and the jolts are sharper, the wheel complains a little more, raising its voice but never breaking, its creak joining the shudders of harness straps and the breath of camels with a kind of musical patience. And at day's end, when the wagon is finally still, its shadow stretched long and cool on the sand, the creak is gone again, but its echo lingers, as if the sound has left something in the air. And those who drift off to sleep closest to that wagon often say they sleep more deeply, more steadily, as though their dreams hitch themselves to the memory of the wheels turning, following it slowly, round and round, through the soft dark of night and into the quiet promise of morning, just to the left of the main fire pit, where the heat lingers long after the flames have shrunk into coals and the smoke curls upward into the stars like tired breath. There always forms, by the end of the evening, a small, familiar pile of shoes, not neatly arranged, not lined like soldiers, but cast gently into a loose heap of leather sandals, felt-wrapped soles, and woven boots softened by time and dust, as if the owners had slipped them off at the edge of comfort and trusted the night to keep them safe. And these shoes, mismatched in size and shape, belong to travelers of every kind, elders with stiff joints who sit on folded cushions, children who curl up with woven blankets, traders who lean back against their packs and exhale deeply, letting the fire wash their thoughts clean. And though the shoes are not remarkable, scuffed, patched, sun-bleached, some with loose stitching, and others with worn-out heels, they hold a kind of quiet dignity, the dignity of distance crossed, of pathways known not from maps, but from the rhythm of each step taken, each mile walked with care, with hope, or simply with routine. And there is something soothing in their presence, in the way they gather naturally without direction, forming a kind of circle of rest, a silent halo around the fire's glow. And no one speaks of the shoes, no one points them out or assigns them a place, but everyone knows they will be there at the end of the long day, as bowls are emptied and stories drift into yawns. The shoes will return, nudged off one by one as sleep begins to draw its quiet curtain. And sometimes, if a strong wind blows or a camel shifts nearby, a shoe might tumble gently from the pile, rolling over once before settling again, and someone will reach without looking, returning it to its cluster like a stone returned to the riverbed. And in the morning, before the sun crests the distant rise, and the first sounds of preparation begin, the ropes being tugged, the pots lifted, the carts creaking to life, the shoes are reclaimed slowly, without urgency, each pair slipped on with that small sigh that comes from the meeting of foot and familiar leather, and the pile dissolves, its edges blurred and scattered like the memory of a dream. And yet it forms again each night, with the same quiet certainty, a ritual without rules, a gathering of rest at the threshold of sleep, and it's said, half seriously, that you can learn something about a person by where they leave their shoes in the pile, near the edge if they're cautious, at the center if they're confident, leaning against another's if they've found companionship. And perhaps that's true, or perhaps it's only that sleep humbles everyone, and the shoes remember, and in this way, the journey continues, even while the camp is still, marked not just by footsteps on the earth, but by the place those feet are finally willing to stop, to rest, to shed their burden, if only for a night. Near the edge of camp, just beyond the farthest sleeping tent, where the ground dips slightly into a shallow basin, lined with smooth stones and tufts of windswept grass, there hangs a lantern, an old iron thing suspended from a hook driven into a crooked post, its sides smudged with soot, and its glass darkened by time. And though its flame is small, almost modest, it is the last to be extinguished each night, the final flicker of wakefulness before the whole caravan gives itself to sleep. And no one is officially tasked with tending this lantern, and yet someone always does. Sometimes the eldest guard with the weather-creased face, who still walks with silent steps. Sometimes a cook cleaning the last pot. Sometimes a child who has woken from a dream and wandered out into the open air. And the act is always the same. A hand reaches up, fingers gently adjust the wick or the glass, and the flame, for a while, glows steady, casting a soft orange light that spills in a slow circle, touching the nearby rocks, the worn wooden crate beneath it, the edge of a resting camel's flank. And in that glow, for a few final minutes, time seems to stretch like the silk threads once traded here, long, delicate, threaded with gold, if only for how it cradles the dark. And some say that this is when the camp is at its most peaceful, not when everyone is asleep, but just before, when the hush is deepest and the world breathes more slowly, and this single light stands like a whisper in the dark, a silent promise that the night will pass gently, and around it, the last rustlings of day fade away. A cough, muffled in a blanket, the tap of a spoon returned to the cook's basket, the final sigh of a camel curling its legs beneath it, and above, the stars press closer, as if watching, and even the wind shifts its pace, brushing the edges of the tent flaps with a quieter hand. And when at last the lantern is ready, when the wick has burned low, and the keeper, whoever they happen to be that night, steps forward one final time, they do not blow it out with ceremony, but with patience, with a stillness that honors the quiet more than the task itself. And the flame flutters once, lifts like a bird deciding whether to stay, and then gently disappears, leaving the iron shell warm and silent. And in the darkness that follows, nothing changes abruptly. The air remains the same. The ground does not shift. The sky holds. But something subtle settles over the camp. A softness even deeper than sleep. A sense that everything is now as it should be. And the one who extinguished the light lingers for a breath or two longer, letting their eyes adjust, letting their thoughts drift like dust on the breeze, then turns slowly and returns to their blanket, their mat, their quiet corner, and the post, the hook, the lantern remain, no longer shining, but still present, a part of the night now, waiting patiently for the next evening. The next moment when light is needed, not to see, but simply to mark that the day is done. And with that, the camp sleeps, the Silk Road sleeps, the journey sleeps, not ended, only paused, breathing softly in the arms of darkness until the morning when footsteps begin again.